Hey everyone, in this crash course we'll be learning about Prestashop 1.7 module development. So to be clear, this will be a part of a paid course that will be hosted on Udemy and Skillshare, and in this part we'll be trying to focus on the minimum basic things actually to clear some foggy topics. So this course will be divided into multiple sections. So the first section will be about general stuff about Prestashop, architecture of Prestashop, the fundamentals of Prestashop development, etc. The second part will be about the module itself. So we're learning how to create a basic module. We'll be learning about various topics, like the hooking system, the admin configuration page. Also be talking about the widget API. And the third part will be about controllers. So here I'll be talking about the legacy controllers, front and back. Then we'll be creating a full example with a modern controller and Symfony and Twig and a lot of things. And finally, this will be basically included in the paid version of the course. It will be about creating a payment module. So we'll be learning about what is a payment module, the anatomy of payment module, what we need actually to have a payment module, and we end up by creating a fully functional payment module. So I'll just leave you to watch the course, and if you are interested in purchasing it, there is a coupon in the description of this video. So it'll be more than a pleasure to see some good comments on this video and good thumb ups, and nice watching. This course will be divided into three big chapters. The very first one will be a quick start, in which we'll be talking general introduction of Prestashop module, understanding the anatomy of a module, understanding the various directories and files, and also will be understanding the various variables and methods that we can find inside the main module files or the controllers or other files on our modules. Then we'll be moving into more advanced topic, more advanced chapter, will be the basic payment module. So it will be an introduction to payment modules, understand the different types of payment modules, understand the API behind these payment modules, and we end up this chapter with by creating an offline payment module, which is actually one of the types of payment modules. So the final chapter will be more advanced comparing to the other one. It will be called external payment module. So as the name external may signifies something that we'll be discovering during this chapter. So the result will be actually creating an advanced payment module. We'll be using an external API. For example, we'll be adopting PayPal as a payment solution for our shop, and more advanced stuff that we'll be discovering during this chapter. In this episode, we'll be talking about the environment setup. So starting with the IDE, so in my case, I did pick VS Code as my preferred IDE. For sure, if you'd like to use any other IDE, you are free to do. So in the market out there is PHP Storm, IntelliJ, NetBeans, PHP Coder, I think, a lot of names. But in my case, I did pick a VS Code for the following reasons. First of all, it's free, it's totally free, open source, and also it does have support to extensions. So simply you need to click on this little icon here to get access to, let's say, 1,000 of extensions that allow you to do various things, whether Git, for Java, for JavaScript, for HTML, for CSS, wherever. So pretty much there is an extension for everything you need on VS Code, on your coding journey. So and also you could customize it the way you need, and it's an elegant IDE. Well, some people do not really consider it as an IDE. Some people say it's text editor, but anyway, so it really do the job very well. So if you did pick VS Code as your tool of coding, then you need to go to code.visualcode.com, and from there you simply click on this little button and pick your version, whether macOS, Windows, or Linux, or we have some other downloads, whatever. So that was the IDE, VS Code. And now we will move to the environment, your PHP and MySQL environment. So in my case, I'm using a macOS Big Sur 11.0. So I followed this tutorial that I will leave you the link to on the description of this video. So step by step how to install MySQL, PHP separately. And that was really pretty simple. If you are on a Windows machine, then my very first and let's say the more good one that I personally tested and really fit well with me is Laragon. It's pretty customizable, pretty fast. As I said here, it's blazing fast. Yeah, so really recommend this one for Windows users. And if you are on a if you are on a Linux, then there's plenty of tutorials out there how to install MySQL, PHPMyAdmin into your machine. And if you would like to avoid all these hassles, you could pick one of the names, example WAMP. They are, I think, available for all the platforms here. For example, example is one of the robust ones, so it's available for Windows, Linux, and macOS. Yeah, so if in case you'd like to avoid any hassle with the command line. All right, once that is installed, you need to check the Prestashop version. It's really important. In my case here, I'm using the latest one for today. It's Monday, 4th of January, 2021, 1.7.7.0. So this is my current version. And to make sure that everything is well compatible with your environment, you need to go to the official repo of Prestashop /php-ps-info, and right there is a PHP file called php's.php that is basically a script that will test the availability of certain extension, the PHP version, a lot of stuff actually that Prestashop needed to run without any issues. So once you download this file, you simply throw it into a directory of your server and access it, and you will get something similar to this. So anything red means that this is a problem you need to fix. If everything is green, then your environment is okay and you could do your job. Okay, so that was a quick tour about for the setup. If you are ready, let's go ahead and see the next episode. In this video, we'll talk about the fundamentals of Prestashop development. So the fundamentals here. Prestashop was basically conceived so that third-party modules could easily build upon its foundation, making it extremely customizable e-commerce software. So let's say the three possibilities of customization that are available on our Prestashop. So first of all, we can customize our shop through themes, right? And the third or the second possibility of customization is through modules. And finally, we can customize our shop through overriding. So let's talk about each point separately. Let's move on and talk about theme firstly. So a theme is basically a front office of an e-commerce and is the section that allows a customer to interact with various functionality in the shop, whether product page, the cart, the checkout, the customer account, etc. A theme is a collection of various types in Prestashop. Basically, or mainly, we have Smartify with an extension .tpl, and we have assets with an extension .css or .js. Now let's move on to the modules, which is an important part of customizing our shop. So a module is an extension to Prestashop that allow developers to do many things, various things with modules. I just mentioned 3 points here. So the point number one would be provide additional functionality to this system. For example, by default, Prestashop does not allow users to log in or to sign into the shop through their Google accounts. With certain modules and certain customization, we can reach this functionality. So an example, adding sign-in option using Google accounts. The second point that I mentioned here is view additional items on the site. So for example, we can add a module, we can use certain modules to, for example, display the best-selling products. This is not available by default, but with certain modules, we can achieve that. So we'll be adding new item or view additional item on the site. The third point is communicate with other e-commerce system or services. For example, we can connect to certain ERP to load products from there, or using certain payment platform like PayPal, Stripe, etc. Okay, now move on to overriding. So what is overriding? First of all, Prestashop is built using the oriented object programming modules. One of the advantages of this is that allow developers with the good combination of code and well-architected code to easily replace or extend parts of the core code of our Prestashop without having actually to modify the main source code of Prestashop. So for example, we can add a new field here to our customer sign-in page or registration page by overriding the customer class. Okay, so that is really simple example that show you the power of overriding. There is plenty of example out there. For example, we can add new let's say input or attribute to our product. For example, add the age of the product, or add an image, or add a video, whatever we want. We could achieve that through overriding. So there's a pro tip here that I would like that you never miss, which is this. So never ever edit core file, because once we update our system, once we get a new version of Prestashop, then all the changes we made to the core file will simply gone, and we will be like resetting all the work we did. Now let's move on to concept. So MVC as root. Everybody know what is MVC. So it's basically model view controller. It's a pattern that separates the logic between certain layers. So we have the module that basically connect to the database. We have the view that represent the data to the user, to the end user. And we have the controller that we can consider it a middleware between the M and the V that orchestrate the data flow. So let's talk about this in our Prestashop environment. So until its 1.6 version, Prestashop was based on a 3-tier architecture. We have what we call object data, which is basically a data access is controlled through files located under the classes directory. And this is basically representing the M, the module. And we have data control. It said here, user provided content is controlled by file and the root folder, which is here simply the C or the controllers. And finally, we have the design or the front side of our shop. And basically, there are the themes that are located under the theme directory. So now let's talk about the newcomer comparing to the 1.6, which is basically the Symfony Framework. So here with Symfony, I entitled it to be Symfony Era Begin because we have a new code base. While old version of Prestashop 1.6 or until 1.6 took a pride of using certain custom or customized architecture, it was decided by the core team to incorporate the Symfony PHP framework starting with the latest 1.7 version since 2017, I think. So the dividing or the driving ideas basically were to have a robust code and to benefit from the power that framework like Symfony does provide, more modular code, and especially a best testability for the code. Hi and welcome back. In this episode, we'll be talking about the technical principle behind the Prestashop module, the big picture, in another term. So let's say what this episode will be composed to. So first of all, we start with an introduction. Then we'll be talking about the operating principle. Third thing will be the module directory, and we will end up with a look to the file structure. So let's start with an introduction. What is a Prestashop module? So basically, a Prestashop module consists of a main PHP file called the main class or the module class that has a specific nomination rule. And here, by looking into the example I mentioned here, you get the point about what I mean. So contact form is our directory, the directory of the module, and the main class, as we said here, the main PHP file is contactform.php. So this is the rule. Your directory name must be exactly the same, the name of the main PHP file. So our module will be composed of this class file, this PHP file, and as many other PHP files as we need to achieve our functionalities, right? So in addition to this PHP file, a module could be composed or containing other files like the .tpl files called templates and other also assets like images, JavaScript, CSS, fonts, etc. to display the module interface, whether to the customer, the front-end office, or we call it front-end controllers or hook, etc. And we'll be talking about this later, or to the merchant, the responsible of our shop who will be configuring things in the back office. Now let's move on to the operating principle. So a module gives possibilities to do an infinity of customization to developers. They are ideal way to let your talent as a developer and imagination express themselves, as the creative possibilities are pretty much unlimited and you can do pretty much any functionality you could add it, or you can, add it to your Prestashop application. So any module can display a variety of content, blogs, text, images, video, etc. Performs many tasks like batch update, import product, import categories, pretty much all the crude operation that any application could do. Interface with other tools like ERP systems, payment gateway like PayPal or Stripe, etc. Can be made as configurable as necessary, and the more is configurable, the better it is for the end user. A module also can add functionality to Prestashop without having to edit the core file, and this is what we call the overriding, and we'll be talking about this later. Now let's talk the module directory. So Prestashop modules are found under the /modules directory, the main modules wrapper. Modules can be also part of a theme. They could be placed under the theme's own /modules directory. So this is an example here, theme, and we'll be having my theme or classic theme, whatever your name of the theme, and /modules. And after that, you could create your own module file. So you could override basically any module template through this path. And also each module has its own subdirectory under the /module. So for example, our contact form is residing under its own directory under the modules directory. Now let's end up this episode with a look to the file structure. So we start with this screenshot displaying the module tree, and as you may see here, we have some newly folder, let's say, that does not exist before in the 1.6 version, whether the src or the config or these YAML files. So let's do a quick tour and we'll be back later with details to each and every files and directories. So the config folder, as I said, is coming from the 1.7. It's a new feature that is introduced to adapt our modules to work well with the newly adapted Symfony environment. The config.xml, it's inherited from the 1.6 versions of modules. Controllers will be containing controllers, the logo, which is the image, the main file, the module name.php, overriding, src, themes, translation upgrade, views, and we'll be talking about this in details later. So let's move on and start first with the main file, module.name.php. Okay, so this main file should have the same name as the module root, as we said in the beginning of this episode. So for instance, if we took the example of block CMS modules, then the folder name must be under the modules directory, the main wrapper /block CMS wrapper, directory, And our file, the main file name, should be under that directory and called the block CMS, all in lowercase. And I do insist on that. Don't ever write any capital letter on this file name .php. And as the screenshot show, I took the contact form as an example. So this is the directory. This is the main file, the main class of the module. So the next things to talk about is the icon file. So simply it's a logo, whether it's logo.png or logo.gif. So a couple of rules to adapt with this image, whether it should be a 32 by 32 pixel, and the extension must be whether PNG or a GIF. And as you may see in this screenshot, it is logo.png for the contact form. And the rule is to call it logo like this. Now we could move to the views directory. This folder contains your modules template file, whether TPL or Twig files. Depending on your need, your files are located in a different subfolders. So the very first example is template/admin. This folder is dedicated for templates used by the module administration legacy controllers. The next folder is template/front. So for template, that will be used by the module front controllers. And finally, the hook, the old school directory, if you can call it that way, is basically used to contain templates that will be used by hooks of our module. So the hooks, if you don't know what it is, it's basically the template that will be used, for example, on a contact form. If you'd like to hook your contact form into the header section, then imagine that we'll be having a header.tpl under this path, under our contact form. Okay, so move on. Another thing that the module can do, that it can override a Twig file from the back office. To do that, declare your own following the same path in views/Prestashop subfolder. So what you are going to do really here is basically overriding one of the core files, TPL files of the Symfony bundle, because now we are adopting Symfony here. So here's an example that will simplify this for you. So this is our original file. It's under admin/product/product page/product.html.twig. And as I said, we have a twig here because we are simply using Symfony. To override this file, here is how to do it. So this is the overriding path. So this will be our module. Let's suppose it's your module or something like that, and you'll be having your views directory here. Then we'll be creating the same path. So Prestashop admin product page/product html.twig. Right? So if you look carefully here, you will understand this. So we have the same path of the file, just we like copy pasted the same path, but under our module, and that way we achieve this override, right? So also you need to know that every asset you need to use in the module, for example, CSS, JavaScript, image, fonts, etc., must be located in their folders. So for example, views, we should have views/another directory called JavaScript or GS, CSS/CSS, IMG, etc. Right? So you get the point. Now let's move on to controllers. This folder contains basically controller classes. Two types of controllers could be found. So we have a front controllers. Basically, it does add a front-end page to our website. And the back office controller, it does add simply a back office page to our website. That would be something like configuration page for, let's imagine that we have some parameters that we are using with our modules. So here's an example here. We have modules, the main directory, and we have our module folder. We have the controllers front, and we have a payment controller module for our module. All right, let's move on now to the classes, a very important directory. A module can have a class or many classes, directories that could be used for two reasons. The reason number one to use the classes with our module is define your own class, your custom classes. So for example here, if you are creating a module that allow users to register commands or votes for products, then we imagine that we have to create a class called users with name, email, something like that, etc., and command with date and with content and with rate, etc. So we need to create these classes like an object to be represented in the database. So this is the very first approach to use custom classes, or this is the first reason to use classes. And the other reason to use these classes is basically to override core classes. You need to follow the same path as the Prestashop application in your module. For instance, if you would like to override, for example, the shop class, then here is how to do it. I leave you this good example. So this is the original file location. It's classes in the root of our application /shop/shop.php. And as you may see here, we don't have the same rules of nomination as the module. We can write camel case or capital S whatever here on the class name. Okay, so how to override this is basically by creating the same path. If you look carefully here, class shop.php, same path, but under our modules /override directory, right? So this is where the override directory is being used to override core file. But just to note something, try to override core classes. This is make the upgrade of your application risky, because let's suppose you are updating a class like the shop or the cart or the product or something really vital to your application. Upgrading this class later could be a problem. It can break certain functionality that is no more compatible with your own overridden version of the class. Now let's talk about the translation. You can translate your module by creating this directory with translation file inside. The directory may contain multiple PHP files, and each file will be responsible of a single language. A nomination rule here is to use the ISO code of your language with a .php extension. So here is an example. If you are like to create a French version of your module, then you need to write fr like this in a lowercase .php, and inside it would be containing the translation. But the thing about this translation, it should not be done manually, but instead we need to go to the admin panel of our application and do the translation from there. So this is the path. You need to access your admin panel again, then go to international translation installed module, and right there you could find the strings from your module that you need to translate. Now let's talk about the theme directory. This folder is essential during modification of an existing module. So the purpose of this directory is basically to overwrite another module template. You can adapt it without having to touch the original module file. We are talking about the other module right here. And notably, it enables you to handle the module's template file in various ways depending on the current theme. Just a note here I left, this is rarely used, only if you need to override certain other modules template. So this is an example on how to implement this override. So this will be your module /themes, and we have here the theme name, for example, a classic, and /module. Let's suppose we need to override the contact form using our module, then we'll be having /contact form. Now let's move on to upgrade. It's self-explanatory. It's basically used to upgrade our module in case we need like to update things, and like if you purchased our module from the store, then upgrades will go through this through the file actually inside this directory. New feature that came up to this module is the service YAML file. If you are creating a modern module that rely on the Symfony Framework code base, this file will be used to first register your own class as a service for Symfony, and also alter the ones provided by Prestashop. And the config.xml, as I said, it's inherited from the 1.6 version. So I think that everybody know what is it. So it's basically a cache file used by the core of Prestashop to get information about the module. If it does not exist, then it will be auto-generated during the installation process. It does contain some properties on the main module class and optimize the loading of the module in the back office. So this is an example of our file. So it's basically an XML file that containing some entries. Here we have the name of the module, we have display name, version, the description, the author, the tabs, whether it's front or back or payment, etc. The confirm install if you'd like to display a message when you are willing to actually install the module. Is configurable, need an instance, limited. So is configurable indicate whether the module has a configuration page or not. Need an instance indicate whether an instance of a module must be created when it's displayed in the module list. And the limited countries, you would like to limit it to certain countries. So nothing fancy about this file, just some entries defining information about our module. Now let's move on to the final point of our episode and on this chapter, which is external libraries. In case your module needs certain SDKs or libraries or something external, then this directory called the /labs will be your host. So it may be called lib, labs, libraries, SDK, vendor, or vendors. Yeah, that's pretty simple. Prestashop is an open source code base, and consistency is so important to have a readable and maintainable code, because basically this code will be accessed, manipulated by a lot of people all around the globe. So we have some rules that we need to follow that this code could be well maintained, as we said. The very first thing that we need to respect is the convention, a general convention on the encoding of the files. So we need to use the UTF-8 without a bomb as an encoding. Also, we need to use the Unix LF line feed as a line ending. And finally, each file must end up with a blank line here. Now move on to some PHP convention that we need to follow. Basically, we have a couple of pages that will illustrate all what we need to follow here in our coding style. So the very first thing is the PSR2 that is accessible through this URL here. So PSR2 php-fig.org/PSR2, and it does list all the rules that we need to follow. So let me just mention one of them. The code must follow a coding style, which is PSR1, and the link is here. The code must use space for indenting, no tabs. Good rules to follow here, and I will leave you the link to this page. The next link that is interesting for us is the coming from the symfony.com, which is the structure, and here again we have some good rules to follow. So the very first thing is added a single space after each comma, added a single space around the binary operators, the equal, the and, etc., which is the exception, with the exception of the concatenation operator. Place an unary operator adjacent to the effect variable, etc., etc. So this paragraph is what we need to follow to let's say to be on the rules, on the standards of coding. Now move on to the strict typing that is introduced starting from the version 1.7.7 of Prestashop. So all the new code should be strictly typed. So what strictly typed mean is basically added in type to the parameters of each method, like this one, and add the returning type. So here to this method is taking two parameters, and if you look here, we have a string and we have array that are basically the types of these parameters, and we have this dot void, which is defining the returning type of this method. Now move on to the JavaScript code convention that is resumed on this page from the Airbnb GitHub repo that is listing pretty much all what you need to follow, even other code other than Prestashop we need to follow, because these are the best practices that everybody agreed to follow. So for example, let's pick arrays. So here a quick example: instead of using the constructor to create a new array, you simply need to use the no array or non-constructor way to create an array, basically using these brackets and assign it. For the array push, instead of direct assignment to add item to an array, so instead of doing something like this, it's better to use the dot push method. So a lot of rules that I really need to follow here to have a solid code base. Now move on to all the HTML and CSS related content. So here we need to this codeguide.co that is basically written by the man who created the Twitter Bootstrap. That is, again, he's listing all the rules you need to follow for the HTML and for the CSS. So I leave you again the link to this. For example, this HTML doc type, enforce standard mode and more consistent rendering in every browser. So he is saying here that we need to add this doc type HTML tag at the beginning of each page to make sure that all the browser render the things correctly, right? So it's pretty simple. Finally, the license information. All Prestashop file must start with a Prestashop license block. So this is the license that we need to place for the core files, and this is the one we need to place for the module file. And I suppose you saw something like this during your journey with Prestashop. So let's say a quick example here. This is the PS banner module, and this is the license block that we need to display on, sorry, we need to add to all the files that we'll be creating during our journey. So that was a quick look at the coding standards, and now we can finally really start creating our very first module. We can finally create our module, our very first module. And to do that, it's really simple. It's simpler more than you imagine, actually. So all you need to do here is creating a directory, and inside the directory, a PHP file. So in my case, I will be using the terminal because I'm feeling more comfortable with. So here I will create a directory. So first of all, I must be under the modules directory. And here I will do mkdir my basic module. So this is the name that I did pick. And again, just to know that the keyword module you are seeing here is not mandatory. It's an optional, it's my pick. I call that my basic module. You could simply call it my basic or my testing module or something like that. So module, you could place it, you could not, right? To be clear. Okay, so right there, I created my module, my directory module, sorry, and now I will access this. And inside this directory, I will touch and my basic module.php. So for you, if you're not comfortable with the terminal, you could do this simply through the Explorer. So here you need simply to create a new directory or new folder, and you give it a name, and inside that directory, you'll be creating a file that is exactly named as the directory. You remember what we said when creating a module? The file name must be exactly the same file used to create the directory. So my basic module should be inside a my basic module directory. So let's go ahead and open this file. So as you may see here, this is a folder and this is the PHP file. Okay, all clean. Let's close this and hide this. All right, so we said also in the coding standards that each file must start with that famous command. So here, just paste that to speed up the process, and let's move on. So the very first thing that we need to do here is basically checking that the global environment of Prestashop is okay. There's no trouble. Prestashop is installed correctly and all is fine. Okay, so to do this, I'll start with an if statement here, and I will use the defined method here to check a certain constant. Okay, so this constant is created during the installation of Prestashop. Don't worry, don't matter, don't really bother yourself how it's been created. The important thing is that we'll be testing its existence, and it's named basically ps_version. Okay, so in case this constant is not defined, we simply will kill the application. So here we type simply the exit. Okay, all is set right here. We could move on to the main class. Okay, so here the main class is basically a simple PHP class. So you start with a class keyword, and now we will be creating our main class name. So here, if you still remember, we said that we'll be using the camel case. So my basic module. Okay, so this is the right name for our class. Okay, then it will be extending a very important class, which is modules right here. And let's command click or control click just to jump into the source code of this class. So as you may see here, it's implementing certain interface. That will be back to this later. But the important here to look at these all attributes. We have the name, we have display name, description, confirmation, author URI. So plenty of information, that are vital for our module to work well with the core of Prestashop. So that was a quick look at this class. We won't get deep at it right now. We're getting back to it later. So right here, after extending the right module class, let's go ahead and create our very first method, which is the constructor. Okay, so it's basically a public function it's a magic function, so we start with a couple underscores here, construct, and for now no parameter will be passed to this. This is why we are getting this warning. Added the nested command to explain why this method is empty. It won't be empty for us, and we will start implementing the code for this method. So the very first thing, we need to define some properties that our module could be interpreted by the core of Prestashop. The very first thing that we need to do is the main, and if you look carefully here, my IDE did the map to the module class. So this is where the public name is being defined, and since we are extending this, we have access to all the public attribute of this module. Okay, so fairly simple here. Oops, sorry. Let's define this to be a name. So the name here, there is a little command here that if you didn't miss that, it said unique name. So this name really must be unique to be used to identify our module in the admin panel. So here I will simply my basic module, I will call it that way, and we're good to go. Okay, now let's move on to another property here that will be the tab. So if you don't know what is this attribute, well, the answer is a bit tricky but easy, don't worry. So here, let me just define for now front. So if you don't know what is a tab, it's basically an attribute that represents the title for the section that shall contain this module Prestashop back office. Okay, so let me just show you with a real example here, because always words kinda hard to follow, especially in coding. So here we are on the module manager page, and we have this category drop down. What you see here is called tabs. So we have tab administration, tab design, tab promotion, product, payment, etc. These are like categories of modules. So we'll be defining our module to be whether for payment or for product page or for shipping or for a customer or for social or specialized platform, etc. So here it's like telling Prestashop what is the type of our module. That's like a simple and brief introduction to the tab attribute. The next attribute I will be defining here will be the version. So pretty obvious here. They will be defining what is the version of our code here. So simply I'll pick 1.0. Okay. Then we'll be defining who is the author of this code. Well, for me, I'll be saying my name here. It's up to you later to define it, whether for your company or for you, whatever. So, and the next one, the next attribute I will be defining is need instance. Okay, this one is a bit tricky too, and I will set that for 0 to 0. So need instance mean whether to tell the core of Prestashop to load an instance of our module when displaying this page. You may be wondering, or maybe asking the question, why shall I need to create an instance? Well, basically, if you look here at these alerts or at updates, these are basically generated by instances of certain modules. So for example, if you would like to display any message like you need to, I don't know, like there's an update, or you would like to display like my module is being enabled or something like that, you know, you need to set this instance to 1. Elsewhere, you set it to 0. And generally, it's set it to 0 to avoid any trouble, and it's also to not to consume more resources, because this page is normally meant to have a listing, not to like interact with anything else than the listing of the modules. Okay, now let's move on to another attribute here. And this one is the PS version compliancy. This is again very simple to understand. So this is basically will be an array, PHP array, and it will tell the core of Prestashop the minimum version of Prestashop that this module is compatible with, and the latest or the maximum version that this module could be installed in. So we start with the very first entry here, and it will be let's use a couple of quotes just to keep things ergonomic. So min, and the minimal version in my case, let's set it to 1.6, and the max I'll be using here how can I write this? Yeah, let's use the current version, just to make sure that it will be available for all the versions. So here ps underscore version. There you go. Great, that's set up correctly. We can now also define the bootstrap. So can I this please? And we'll be telling we need the bootstrap to be loaded. Oh, sorry, it must be a boolean here. So what this bootstrap do is basically set to true to enable bootstrap theme on the configuration page. Okay, so let's suppose that your module will have a configuration page, for example, like the main menu here. When you click on a configure and you are landed into this page, this is called the configuration page. If this module does not have bootstrap enabled equal to true, then everything will be like messed up. I won't see this styling of the button and these input and these drop down. So when you do bootstrap true, meaning that you will be beneficial, you will benefit, of the styling of Prestashop elements and component. I'm speaking HTML here, right? So let's move on. Now it's time to call the parent constructor, right? So here we are kind of persisting all these data to the core. So I'll be calling the construct. There we go. So here, okay, we still have like to define a couple or three of attribute. The very first thing is display name. So this will be the name that we'll be using to display our elements. So for example, here, let me back to the list. Okay, this is a display name. This one you see here is a display name, like main menu, banner, category tree link, etc. So let's define a good name here. So let's suppose this will be my very first module. Okay, so at this point I would like to tell you about another function here, which is the translation. So let's suppose that your module will be sold on the add-ons store and people from around the globe will purchase it, and you write your code or your messages like this display name only in English, and a man from, I don't know, from Tunisia purchase it, or from China who don't understand English, then that will be a problem, right? So here we need to adopt another method from our from the module, call it the L. Okay, so it's very simple as a syntax here. Let's jump into this and see what these do. Look at this description. Get a translation for a given module text. This is self-explanatory. We won't waste a lot of time on that. So it simply does accept a string, and a specific is false generally, and we have the local here. So what is interesting for us is this string. Okay, now let's move back here. As we said, we did define our message to be there, and semicolon. Okay, now let's move on to another important attribute, which is description. This is very important for SEO stuff and referencing your module. So here we'll be telling that, so this will be, let's call it again the L here. Okay, let's say this is a great testing module. All right, let's suppose this is a good message that describe what our module do. All right, let's scroll a bit down and let's add another attribute. Why not? So here, let's say confirm uninstall. So this will basically display a message to the merchant administrator the moment he click on the uninstall our module. So again, it will be a message. So here, let's do this and L, and like, are you crazy? Let's do something special. Are you crazy? Now with all this in place, we can say that we have a valid module. So let's go back to the admin panel, module catalog, and try to see if our module is available. So just give it a second that it does load, because basically this page display local non-installed module and modules from the store. As you may see here, we have some paid modules. So here, if you don't find quickly your module, you could simply use one of the keywords we did define here. For example, you can search using my very first module like this. Okay, let's see if that will help. So, oops, I clicked on that, sorry. So by clicking here, well, it translated into a list of keywords, but To quickly find our module, we could use our unique key, which is my basic module, which is the name, and it's not there. Let me check in the installed module, because sometimes it does really interpret things wrongly. There we go. So let's install this and see what will happen. So when I do install, you are about to install my very first module. Are crazy you are going to do. So this is the message that we did define, and we have an option to delete it, so we won't be deleting that. And let's hit yes to install it. Okay, let's move back here to module catalog and to basically reinstall that to check that everything is okay. So here I will test if it's available. There we go. So my very first module is here, the version 1.0 by me. This is a great testing module. It's a free, and let's hit install. Okay, so it's installed correctly. We have the green message right here and everything is okay. We can carry on with our module. In this episode, we will explore a very important methods for our module, which are basically the install and the uninstall. So in order to use them, we need to override them. Okay, so you may be wondering, what do you mean by overriding them? Let me just remind you that our basic module here is extending the module, and the methods that we are talking about are basically implemented inside this module. Let's go to core module and right there search for install method. This is it. This is the install method, and also the uninstall method, which is this one. So our module need to override these methods in order to use them. And here let me pick a contact form as a good example that it does implement the install method, as you may see here. So here I just added a typing or returning type just to tell you what kind of type is returned by this method. So it simply does return a boolean, and this is a result of a combination of certain calls to certain methods that each one of them will return whether true or false. So let's talk about these couple of calls here. We have a call to the parent install. So basically we are initiating a call to the parent install that is simply the one that is located under the module class. Yeah. Then next we are calling a register hook that is taking as a parameter to register GDPR consent, that is basically registering our module to this certain hook once it get installed. All right, so this will return boolean, this will return a boolean, and the combination of all the instructions that will be happening here will be telling whether the installation went well or not. So in case you have a true here at the end of all this execution, the module will be installed correctly. Elsewhere, we'll be returning a false, and we'll be having like red message telling that something went wrong with the installation. So generally, the instruction that we'll be finding here will be the parent hooking the module to a certain hook, and also in case we need to create a certain database table, then we'll be also calling that here, like doing SQL installation method separately from this and call it, and simply does return a true, something like that. So we'll get into this later. So this is the install method. We have also the uninstall method that is basically here. This is the main implementation inside the module. So this method will simply do exactly the opposite of this method. So in case, let's imagine that we created a database table here inside the install, that in install basically reverting that and deleting that class or that table, sorry, and we'll be calling the uninstall here instead. So let's go ahead and implement that into our class or our module. So simply I will copy this to speed up a bit the process, and somewhere here let's add a couple of words here, install method, and pasting that. Okay, let's suppose I would like to keep that, and that's fairly enough. We can remove this because that depends on your PHP version, all right? And let's duplicate this too here, just to simply type the uninstall method, and we need to update this to uninstall, and here we'll be calling the parent uninstall too, and we can get this removed. this is a correct setup for our module install and install. But again, it's very basic and very simple, and we can do a lot more stuff with these methods. For example, creating a database, as I said. So let me just show you an example here. Let's suppose I would like to create SQL install here. So I will do something like this. So let's do public function, come on, db install, something like that. And here again, we should return Boolean as always. And here we'll be doing some SQL query that create certain table. All right. So here, let's suppose I'll return true. And here, during the installation, I will add this condition. So let's return to the line that things could be more organized here. There we go. With a capital of L, I would like to have things correctly spelled. So in this case, then the installation success will depend on this method too. Then the creation of database must pass correctly, that we could have it true, and that all these instructions get it true, so we get an installation passed correctly. In this episode, we'll be talking about the configuration object, that is basically a class located under the classes directory right here in our Prestashop core files, and it's simply used by developers to store their module settings directly into a certain table in the database without the need to use any SQL query. Everything is handled by method inside this class. So this class basically is responsible on dealing with this configuration table, right? So let me just introduce to you the structure of this table. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 attribute inside this table. The very first one is an auto increment. It's basically the ID. Here it's called ID configuration, and we have a 2 ID shop and ID shop group that are basically for multi-language stuff and for multi-shop stuff, multi-store property or feature that is still not available on Prestashop 1.7. And the two next are the two main attributes that we are interested on. The very first one is the name, and the next one is the value. So the name will be basically the name of the attribute that will be the key on itself, and I'll explain this later. And we have the value, so the value will be the value of this name, and we have also some datetime attributes. The very first one is when this value is being or has been added, and the other one is when it has been updated the last time. All right, let's get into the content of this table, how we could understand this better. The very first one is really good example to understand what's going on here. So the very first one, it has the ID configuration 1, shop group, and ID shop null by default. And we have the very first one, as I said, it's the key to itself. So we have PS-lang default, and it has a value of 1, meaning that the default language of this website is the language with an ID 1. And why did I say, I'm just repeating this, why I said that PS-lang is reference to itself? I mean that when I need to tell what kind of default language is being used, then I'll be querying this table and find the value of a certain entry that is referenced by name equal to PS-lang default. All right. So behind the curtain, I'll be doing something like this. So not me, but the configuration class will be doing something like this. So it will be select value from our table PS configuration, where PS configuration name equal to PS-lang. And here, if I do execute, I have 1 here. So here it's telling me that default language of this shop is 1. Okay, so let's go back and see how this goes through this configuration class. So this class actually presents some very important and main abstract methods that allow us to interact with that database table that we looked at it some seconds ago. So the very first method here is the get. So as the name is explaining here, get will be getting something from the database, and this is the method. So quick look at this command here, it said that it get a single configuration value, but in one language only. What does that mean? Okay, let me just move back to this database explorer and look at this PS configuration. You may be wondering what is the relation between configuration and configuration language. For example, let's suppose here I stored somewhere here. Let's pick, for example, any attribute that has a value. Okay, let's pick PS invoice model here. And let's suppose I would like to have a multi-language value for this invoice. Let's suppose I have French, Arabic, German in my shop, and this invoice is not the same between each language. So here this PS-lang will be basically storing the translation of the key that is under the PS configuration. This is why we are talking about language here. And this is why also we have an ID long passed here as a parameter. So the key is the key, and here I left a small example that how a key may look like. So it basically is string. It will be to look something like this. For example, here PS volume unit and ID lang, which language you would like to get this this key. If you don't need sorry, if you don't need any language, then you simply left this to null. The next parameter is the ID shop group, and ID shop generally by default null, and the default is by default false, and the rest simply an SQL query finding that key from the database. We don't worry about that. Let's move on to another important method, which is getMultiple. So it's basically the same as get, but here with a bit more features. So here get several configuration value, but again in one language. So here the difference between the get and this getMultiple is simply here this attribute. So instead of passing a simple key, we are passing keys, and this keys is basically an array as written here. So again, it will return an array, and it will be key value. The key will be the key that is inside this array, and the value retrieved in the database table. Now let's move on to another important one, which is update value. Don't worry, don't get fooled by the name update. It basically do two rules here. Look at this little command: update value, update configuration key and value into database. But here they said automatically insert if key does not exist. So this basically is save and update combined into a single function. So the signature is again very simple. We have the key and we have the values in case we will need to have a multilingual as written here. So values is an array of if the configuration is multilingual, and if not, it will be a single string. So here you can pass like a simple string, and also you can pass an array of strings. And here we have HTML false, simply to specify is if HTML is authorized in a value, ID shop group, ID shop again default null, and the rest is done by this beautiful method. So it's basically an update, or it will be an insert if you look it into this this code, right? So again, all the stuff will be done by this method. We don't need to bother ourselves. Again, one more method before that we finish with this chapter is the delete, so that we could complete the crude operation here. So delete a configuration key in database without language management, with or without a language management. So here it will be simply passing the key, and the rest will be done by this amazing method. So again, SQL queries are behind the curtain, and everything is done by this class. That was a quick introduction to this configuration class, this amazing class that we'll be using during the development of our modules. And here I would like to show you some real example about how this class is being implemented. So here I'm inside the contact form module and inside this getContent method, and we see here that we have a configuration update value. So this is how we call this method, since we said that they are static, so we don't need to create instance. And here we are passing the key, and here we are passing the value. So again, let me just show you the case. So it's simply a string defined here inside the variable. Let's see if we can find some get. There we go. This is the get, again, static access to that method, and we are passing the key to that here. We did not define any language. In the next episode, we'll be talking about hooks. Hey everyone, welcome back to this new episode in which we'll be talking about the hooks, what are they, and how they are used in our Prestashop system. So we know that modules plays a big role on customizing Prestashop, and this integration basically took place using hooks. So hooks are places on the code where modules that could be subscribed in and provide content, whether HTML or certain code, JavaScript, whatever, that they inject the code there. They render something on that hooks. Okay, so it's a bit general presentation, but let me get into the subject quickly. So hooks are divided into two types in the Prestashop. We have what we call the display hooks. So they are mainly used in templates. They allow modules to provide content that will be injected somewhere in the template. And here is a quick example that I took from the display reassurance module, the reassurance module. Well, what a weird name to have. Okay, so here we have a method, a public method with a hook display. This is the signature of a front hook or a display hook, and we end up with some random keyword reassurance or whatever, and it does accept some parameters here. That is basically the scope or the context of Prestashop, and the important also that it does return certain, whether it is HTML or return some TPL files. So it's very simple and pretty much used by all the modules. Now let's move on to the second type of hooks, which are the action. Well, for the action hooks, they are a bit complicated because they allow module to be informed of something happening in the system and optionally alter the system's behavior by modifying provided data. So for this second type, we can say that modules are subscribers and require that an event happen at the system level that they can execute certain actions. Okay. Let's get into some examples that we could understand better these approaches. So we have again the block reassurance, and I do pick the hook action front controller set media method. That is basically again a hook, but here with a different signature comparing to the previous one, because the previous one, if you remember, it's called hook display, and here we are saying hook action, right? So hook action front controller set media, and we are doing some treatment here that is very simple here. Let me just explain you so quickly here. So we have media add.jsDef that is basically defining a JavaScript variable inside the front end, and we're passing it later. And here we are using the configuration object that we talked about in the previous episode, and to get certain PSR icon colors. And here we're calling register style sheet and register JavaScript to define some assets, CSS and JavaScript files to the front end part of the shop, right? So pretty simple. Now let's move on to where this action is being initiated. So this is where actually we are subscribing to this event. We are reacting to certain set media action that's happened somewhere else on the system. And let's go ahead and see where this action took place, where it's being emitted, let's say, if we are talking reactive programming here. So here I took this example from the front controller.php, the set media to be specific, and here I took some code to speed up, to make the code simple here, and I'm calling to register style sheet and JavaScript again to insert some CSS and some JavaScript files here. And look at this line here, hook exec, and we are calling action front controller set media, and we are passing an empty array. I think this does remind you of something that we saw in a second here. So action front controller set media is basically the name of the method, action front end controller set media, and we simply concatenating the hook keyword. It's here where that hook is being initiated. So this hook exec method will trigger an event that all subscribed modules to that specific hook will be notified, and they will receive an array passed in parameter, and this is the array. In our case, it's simply an empty array. Also important to know that module can subscribe to multiple hooks, and a single hook could have multiple module hooked to it. In addition to the predefined hooks, Prestashop offers the possibility to create our own custom hook. Again, let me just remind you that we have two types of hooks, the action hooks and the display hooks. So for the action, the type that you are getting triggered by event that take place in a Prestashop, and the display is simply that will render content to whether front or the backend. Okay, let's see how to really create a new hook. The very first type or the very first solution to create a new hook is a bit complicated in my point of view, because you need to use the hook class, and using that instance you will be defining some parameters, and this example does illustrate pretty much all what you need to do. So here we have we are creating a new instance and we are defining the name. So the name will be the key here, and again here we are using the display because it's simply a display action, and if it was an action that would be having action my custom hook, right? So next we are defining the name. This will be like a human friendly name, like the name of your hook module. You can call it, for example, product image on click, something like that, something really random. And we have the description again for human stuff and the position, and finally we end up with an add, that is the method that do inject this hook into the database and make it available. The next type is more simple in my point of view, because you will be passing through the register hook method that is callable during the installation of our module. So here I'll just pick this example randomly from a certain module that is registering a new hook called my custom hook. And again we are creating a display hook, not an action. If it was an action, then it would be an action right there. Let's go a bit deeper with our subject and open our the front page of the website. And let's go to this specific section, the header section, and I go ahead and inspect this. So I just want to show you something here. Okay, let me scroll to the right a bit. There we go. So I'm interested on this little comment. Look at this, begin of whatever, and PS customer sign in, PS customer sign in.tpl. What is this exactly? This is basically a command telling that the content you are seeing after this little command and before the end of the commands, that is being rendered from this PS customer sign in.tpl, meaning that our module, and in this case is the customer sign in, is being hooked here into a certain hook that is being defined there. So the question here, what is the hook that is displayed here? The answer is very simple. You need to go to the design position in the admin panel and simply search for sign in, search for the name of the module you would like to know what kind of hook is being hooked to. So here we have display nav2, meaning that we will have somewhere into our template file a call to this hook. So I'll go ahead to my IDE, and in my case I'm using VS Code, and I will open this header.tpl. And there we go, we have a hook called display nav2. So this is how we call a hook in Prestashop 1.7 and 1.6. This is the legacy way to call a hook. And later on this course, we'll be exploring different ways to call a hook. So let me explain the syntax here. We have the hook, which is basically a call, like let's suppose we are calling a method, and this method is called hook, and we are passing a parameter h that simply represents the hook, and we equal the value that will be the name of the hook that we need to display it here. And here with this little statement, I tried to explain what is this exactly. So display the hook with the name display nav2 here, meaning that we'll be rendering all the modules that are being hooked to this display nav2 into that specific section. And in our case, language selector, currency block, shopping cart, customer sign-in will be displayed at this place. Okay, let's go a bit more deep with our code, and I do invite you to check this hook.php and specifically the exec. So previously we talked about the front controller and how it's executing, how it's calling the hook exec method with certain value and an empty array. So this is the method that we talked about. This is the exec, it's a static. This is why we are calling it this way with a two period like this. This is a static method, and it take
more than a couple of parameters, but what is interesting for us is this: the hook name and the args. And by default, the args is empty. This is why we passed in an empty array here. So finally, hooks are a great feature in Prestashop, and it could be considered as the vertebral bone of the system because it handles all the content generated, whether for the end user or the shop manager. In the next episode, we'll discover how to use these hooks with our module. In this episode, we'll introduce one of the ways on how to actually use hooking into our module. So the very first is the legacy hooking system, and as always, looking into a real example is better to understand. So here I pick the block reassurance module to explain this hooking system, and specifically I pick this hooking display nav. This is called a hooking method, and it's basically used to generate content into a certain placement of the theme. In this case, it's the block header that is containing this display nav full width. And in previous episode, we talked about how we can call hooks into certain template file placement. All right, so here I explicitly added this text, this message, that we could make sure that we have some content outputted by this method. Now, if we go back to the admin or the front page of the website and I do refresh here, you could see already that we have hello from that hook name, hook display nav full width. Now let's go to the admin panel and specifically to this design position, and we have this page that is basically listing all the hooks available into our system, and under each hook all the modules hooked to it. So if you still remember, we said that a module could be hooked to multiple hooks and a hook could have multiple modules hooked to it. So it's a relation of many to many, right? Okay, now let's go ahead and create our very first hook for our module. So you remember we have a my basic module that we created previously. We did define some methods here, and now it's time to give it more horsepower by the hook system. Okay, so again, it's very simple. We start with a public function here. And this function, I will start its name with the hook. So this is the convention that always you start with a hook, and I will do display footer, and I will be pass a params here. This is global object available for the context of Prestashop, and we need also to return a message here. So let's say hello. Okay, so whatever message you would like to define here. And let me explain to you what is going on with this method. Once we did define it, we are basically making our module available to be hooked to this display footer hook. So our mission should be now finished on the admin panel because we need to manually hook this module at this time, because normally if you still remember what we said on the installation method here, we could define where we want to hook our module when we do install, but now since we are developing, we should do this manually. So here we have this drop down saying modules, and we have transplant that represent basically the list of hooks available for the selected module. So let's go ahead and select my very first module. This is basically the module that we are working on, and we have transplant to when the value has been updated, and we have only one hook is available, which is display hook. So we have a little description, this hook display new blocks in the footer. So let's go ahead and scroll all the way down. So just a word about this input here, exception. It's basically, it will add an exception on this hook where not to display content from your module onto this hook into certain page. So let me just explain this. So for example, we'll be hooking our module here to the footer, and we do not want to display this message on the cart page. Then we need simply to select that page here, right? So that was pretty simple to understand, but most of the time you won't need to mess around with this. So let's go ahead and hit save there. So we have the module has been transplanted successfully. Now let's scroll all the way down since the footer is down somewhere here. Now let's refresh the page, and there we go. We have hello from the basic module footer hook. So that was successfully creating the very first legacy hook for our module. In the next episode, we'll continue with the legacy hooks, but instead of defining this static message, we'll be using a certain TPL file that will be living under the views directory. In this episode, we'll be adding a template to this hook display footer method. Okay, so let me just remind you a bit about the folder structure. So here I'm under the official documentation of Prestashop, and this template views folder. So this folder contains your module templates file, the TPL, the HTML.twig in case you are using the Symfony content. So depending on your needs, your file are located in different subfolders. So we start with the views, templates, admin. So basically for administration legacy controller, we have the views template front for templates used for the front office controllers, and we have a views template/hooks for template file used by module hooks. So today we need to first create this directory. So let me move back to my IDE here, open the Explorer, and somewhere here where we have my basic module, I'll go ahead and create a new directory or new folder here. We need to call this one, basically, let's remove that slash right there, and that is our directory structure. So we have the module, views, template, hooks. And inside this directory hooks, let's create a new file, and I'll call this footer.tpl. All right. So in this footer, we'll be simply rendering whatever content we would like to have. So whether it's something that's coming from the database and pass it through parameters or some treatments here, or simply a static method. So it's about getting this method here, this text, and simply displayed it on each one here. And okay, there we go. So, and let's save this, make sure that you hit this save. Now let's move back and update this method. So the question now is how we can point this method to render this file, this footer.tpl. So if you don't know how to do that, you could whether look to the documentation or simply go to any existing module here, for example, again with a block reassurance, and simply type .tpl, okay? So here we have the method that we need, all right? So we have this display method with a file and views directory. So this is direct access to that TPL. But also I'd like that you know that instead of display here, we have another method, which is basically the fetch, like this little example here. So we have the fetch and we're passing the template name that is defined somewhere up, and we get into that in a second, and we are passing an ID of the cache. So generally you don't need this cache most of the time, but in case you would like to make sure that you are dealing with cache correctly, then you need to pass this ID, get cache ID, and the cache ID and the value basically, or the parameter is basically the name of the module. So let me just show you what this template file mean. So it's basically defined here, and it's this string that is simply the module followed by the full path to that TPL file. But in our case, I will adapt the display method here. So I'll go ahead and copy this quickly and moving back to our module. Let's get rid of this. And there we go. So what is missing here is simply need to update this to hook instead of admin, because we are pointing into a hook template, and also we need to update this to footer. Okay, now it's time to truth and test this that everything is went well. Let's go back to our front page and refresh and try to see if everything went well. So there we go, we have this, and let's go ahead and inspect it just to make sure that the content rendered is in each one really. So make this bigger, and there we go. So we have in each one and hello from the basic hook. Hey, and welcome back. In this episode, we'll be passing some dynamic data to our template. So let me just remind you what we did previously. We created this template under the templates hook directory, and inside it we defined some static content. But now let's see how we can pass some dynamic content right here. So to do that, as always, I do invite you to really make your hands dirty, okay? So let's go to this block reassurance and search for how we can pass content from our, let's say, our controller module to the front page. So let's search for assign here. And as always, as I said always on my course, I always try to put myself at the place of someone who don't know what is Prestashop. Okay, so look at this 306 line. We have this context of Smarty assign. Okay, so assign is self-explanatory. Let's see if we can have some documentation. Assign, okay, there we go. Look at this. Assign a Smarty variable and assign it to a template for sure. So we are calling this method from the context of Prestashop and the Smarty object, right? So assign is basically coming from this Smarty object. So this syntax is pretty simple. Let's go ahead and copy this and finish the work onto our module. All right, so here on this method, let's go ahead and do this. So it's a method, we could call it, and inside it, it accepts an array. So let's try to navigate into the signature of this method. So look at this. As I said, assign a Smarty variable to template, and the signature start with a TPL vars that could be an array or a single attribute, and we have the value here, and we have no cache that by default it's false. So it's basically is an array here, testing if it's an array, then it will do some treatment to get key values and assign them to the template. Yeah, we don't need to really care about this, what's going on here, just to get an idea about what's going on when you call certain functions. Now let's go back to our module and let's create our very first parameter. So the parameter or the variable is basically a string at this life stage, okay? So let's go this and call it my param text, for example, or test, or whatever you want really. And it's an array, so here we could define the value, right? So let's go ahead and, for example, say my name, okay? Let's go ahead and type Mohammed Habib Alwi, okay? Then let's move back to the template page and say hello to whatever name we pass it. And this is how we call a variable passed to the template in Smarty. So $, sorry, what's going on here? $, and brackets, and here we need to copy this because this will be the name of the variable. Paste in that there, and let's go ahead and test this out. So again, we need to close this and let's refresh the page. And we broke something because here an expected return happened somewhere here because we forgot semicolon. I'm sorry for that. So let's refresh again. Okay, we broke something again, and basically the dollar must be inside. I'm sorry for that. And I did not cut this because this will happen with you. So just wanna show you some real example coding. So there we go. We have hello Mohammed Habib Alwi. So that was how we can pass a parameter, dynamic parameter into our template. So for sure later your values will be something dynamic, right? You could get, for example, from the shop object, you can get the name or something like that. So let's go ahead and see what kind of content could be available under this shop object. So we could do the following. So you can stop actually the episode here, but I'd like to add more fun to it. So let's go ahead and dump this. Let's go with the printer, for example. We have cart basically, so we can access the cart and we can have the ID. Okay, let's go a bit fun with this. So here we go cart and let's get the ID of the cart. So we will have the ID of the cart here, it's 9. So we could pass basically this one as a parameter. Now let's get rid of this and type another one, ID cart, something like this. By the way, there is no rule really on naming this. You could use the camel case, you could use whatever naming rule here. So here I'll be getting this ID card as a value, as a parameter, sorry. Moving back to our template and let's add an HR here. And let's say the cart ID is, and again, $, brackets, and there we go, ID card. Okay, now let's refresh again and see if something went well. So again, it seems like I put the $, out of the parentheses. So again, I'm sorry for that. Now refreshing, and there we go. So let's see what will happen. So we have this, the current card is, or ID is 9. Hey, and welcome back to this new episode in which we'll be talking about the new hooking way, the widgets. So here, this is the main documentation page on the Prestashop website, the documentation website. And they said that widget is an advanced concept introduced on 1.7, extending hook feature. So here they talked about the limitation of hooks, of the legacy hooks that we explained in the previous episode. So in their basic use, a display hook will be shown at a specific place on the template. If a module wants to display the same additional content on several places, whether for example the merchant choice, it still has to register and implement all the possible hooks. And if you still remember what we did previously with our basic module, we have only one available hook. So imagine that we need to hook it to the top, to the bottom, to the product page, to somewhere here on the product. Then we need to create a method for each and every hooking point. So with widget, module developer can display content everywhere. And here I insist on this word everywhere. The module is asked to do so. So when a module implements widgets, in its code, it allows a module first add the theme to call the module directly with this signature method, a widget, and the name of the module, and also the core to fall back on its registered hook is called by its method hook. Hook name does not exist. So basically this means that the core of Prestashop will rely on hooks to display the content from that module, even if our module is not hooked to, for example, to a certain display footer. So in my case here, if I would like to display, for example, my module into the header section here, and I don't have that hook display header, then the core of Prestashop will rely on hooks to fulfill this need. So here they said make a module widget compliant. In order to be a widget compliant, a module needs to follow two steps. First step is to implement an interface. Before calling a module for a widget, the core must be sure your module has this feature available. So in our case, this interface is located under the core modules of Prestashop bundle. And here we have a quick look at the GitHub repo that represent what is this interface. Again, let me make this bigger here. So as you may see, it's an interface with two public methods, the render widget and the get widget or get widget variable here. Okay, so we'll be talking about this later. This is basically an introduction. So the method render widget is entry point for the core in order to get the generated view. Fetch a Smarty templates. The method getWidgetVariable return the variable you want to assign to the Smarty. Okay, so render widget and getWidgetVariable is self-explanatory. So the render widget will be the method that will generate that content to the front page. And the get variable is the one that will be injecting these what we call variables into this method that will be used later in the template. So it's a bit confusing, but don't worry, later when we start coding you will understand this. So here we have some parameters talk. So the parameters sent to both functions are the hook name, what kind of hook we need to basically to display, and the configuration. This is equivalent to the params that we do pass classically here. For example, this params right there. Okay, now let's go ahead and see how we can call a widget. Once the module has implemented the method render widget, there are two ways to call it. So the old way is to hook exec and the hook name. Let's read this. The first one is by triggering the hook manually registered to the module, but not implemented by it. So here from a PHP class, we could execute our module into a certain hook. And also from a Smarty, you can use hook H, and we can define the hook name right there. Now let's get into this image, that will simplify this hassle. So we have here a hook that is somewhere on the core of Prestashop need to be displayed, and this one is display left column. So what's going on with our system behind the scene? The question one, hook exists on a module. Do we have any module that does implement display left column hook? So if it's a yes, then we go to this module, for example X, or our basic module that we are working on currently, and let's say if it does implement this hook display left column. So if it's a yes, then we simply will return the content from that hook. If it's a no here, then let's say if our module does implement the widget API. If it's a yes, then we will be basically executing this render widget method with the hook display left colon and with the parameter that we need to pass to our template, and the content will be rendered from there. And if it's a no, then we could do nothing simply because we don't have the old school hook and we don't have the widget. We simply do nothing. From a Smarty template, which is basically the recommended as mentioned right here, we could call a module widget this way. So start with a widget, again inside the brackets, and the name equal a module name, and here make sure to use a single quote, not a double quote. And also we could pass a specific hook to that module. So again, starting with a widget, the name of the module, and hook equal to whatever hook you want to pass. And this is basically used later to make the distinguish between what kind of template to be rendered in that specific place. Also, we can call a widget from the PHP class. So for example, here we have call to a static method called render widget. We are passing the module name, and we are passing also the hook name, and we are passing the params. So here the hook name and the render widget will be depend on the value provided to the optional hooks parameters. All right, so I think that we talked a lot on this episode. Now it's time to move on and make this in action, and we train on using widget that we could really understand this better. Hey, welcome back to this new episode in which we'll be making our module widget API compatible. So as always, I would like to start with something that is really already exists, and in this case again I'll be picking the block reassurance, and I will scroll all the way to the top where we have the definition of the class, and this is what we need to start with. Implement the widget interface that we talked about previously, and let's go ahead and revisit it. So again, it does implement two methods, the render widget and the getWidgetVariable. All right, so let's go ahead and implement this method. Back to our module here, my basic module, where we have the definition of the class, and in addition to extend, we'll be implementing widget interface. So here we need to load it, right? So this is the namespace being added here, and we still have a red line because we need also to implement or to override these two methods. Look to the error, does not implement the method render widget and get variable widget. So let's go directly to this interface and copy these two methods here, moving back to my class and scroll all the way down here and do this. Again, we could move back to block reassurance and see the render widget. This is good training for you on how to deal with the Prestashop and with code base that you are not comfortable with and you don't know how it's running. Okay, so let's talk about the render widget inside this class. So it's the default signature with hook name and array of configuration, and here we have an if statement. If hook name, which is a parameters, equal to display footer, they will be returning nothing, will be like returning false here, and elsewhere will be returning a Smarty. First of all, we'll be assigning a Smarty here, and here look at this, we are assigning using the getVariable widget, and finally we are returning a template using the fetch method that we talked about previously. So I'd like to pick your attention to this little instruction here. We have an if hook name equal to display footer. You may be wondering, how can I know what is the hook name? Because at the time, if you remember, we are calling widget API something like this. So we're doing widget and name equal to something like this, right? Let me just remind you what we saw previously. We saw this little instruction call with a hook name. In addition to the name of the module, we can pass the hook name. So this is what gives us the possibility to do something like this. And this is also why we can have this hook name set to null all the time. Okay, so in case you would like to define a specific template, as I said previously, you could use the hook name. Okay, now let's move back to our module and finish the implementation, because our method does not have a body, which is not okay for PHP. And for now, let me just again rely on this and recopy this instruction. Okay, for now I won't pass anything, and also I will return true. Quick formatting right there, and we have the fetch method that is basically take a template path as the first parameters and deal with some caches for the second and the third parameters. So for now I need to define a template file, or simply I can do this. Okay, but this won't be okay because I need to add the module like this. So module, and we need to add in my basic module like this, slash view slash template, etc. Oh, sorry, it's not there. Basically need to define the hook name to here, basically inside this TPL file. So passing that, and let's see what kind of changes. And to challenge you more, I would like to put this method into comment. Okay, so moving back to our front page, and let me refresh the page. We have this crash because param task is not being defined inside this footer TPL. So let's go ahead and update our template. But also this is a good news because our module is pointing to our file. And also this, and let's add some content here. Let's fix this and let's retest this again. So everything went well, and we have our message. Okay, that's not enough to explore the power of widget API. Now let's look at this. So here I'll type my very first module, and look to this. I have now all the hooks available for my module to be hooked to. So for example, I would like to display it to the top somewhere near the logos and things like that, and I simply hit save there. So the module transplanted correctly. Now if I move back to my front page and I do refresh, in addition to this we are using the widget, we can also have another call to that module template right here. Now let's go a bit deeper with this, and let's go ahead to the header template file, and let's go and copy this little line here. So we'll be calling our module into that specific section somewhere near this here, and go ahead and oops, sorry, let's do my basic module here. So this is the name of the module, and the hook will be display. Okay, let's copy simply this name here. All right, let's see how this will look like. So we have another call here from this from a different widget. Okay, so start being messy here, but let's go ahead and add more fun. As I said, let's move back to our module, and we will simply copy this little instruction here. So I'll be saying if the call is coming from this display nav full width, then do the following. Right, so instead of returning, I will simply return hello, this is an exception, for example, from the hook. All right, let's say if this will work. So refreshing the page, and there we go. So now we are really playing around with the widget API. So that was a quick introduction on how to introduce the widget API into your module. In the next episode, we'll see how we can benefit from this getVariable widget. Hey, and welcome back to this new episode. So today we'll be talking about the getWidgetVariable, or the second method that represents the widget interface. So it took as a parameter the hook name and an array of configuration that is basically similar to the params that we get in the previous legacy code. All right, so what does this method do? It's basically return an array of parameter that we need to pass them to our template. All right, so again, inside this block reassurance, which is really a good example that we could start with, let's see how this method is being used. So look at this statement. Is a smart assign. This is the classic way to assign parameters or variable to the template. And here in the value section, we are simply calling this method that, as I said, will return an array. So again, we are here passing the hook name and the configuration that are At the same time, the parameter pass it to our render widget. Okay, so let's move on here, and we have some treatment here going on, stuff, etc. And we are defining the element array. For now, it's empty, and we have some for each statement that is basically injecting some values, some key values to that element, and we end up with returning an array, as I said, with a key element, and the value is the array that we constructed during the processing of our script. All right, let's go ahead and make this available also for our module. So for now, I will go ahead and simply here return, and I will return an array. And oops, this is not the array syntax, correct syntax, sorry. So brackets, there we go, and I'll be moving back to my TPL file, and I'll create my param test. Okay, so again, single quote, and let's type Prestashop developer. Let's make things universal developer. Okay, now we need to call this method inside the render widget, and to do that we could simply do $this context smarty and call the assign method, and we simply call this $this again get widget variable. Okay, and don't forget to pass these two parameters. So simply we'll be copying the signature of the render widget API. Now let's go ahead and test this. So moving back to our front page and refreshing, and normally we should see hello Prestashop developer. So everything is working fine. Same thing for the footer section, hello from, and we have the other message that is also being displayed on that template, which is this little message right here. Now let's go ahead and add another parameter, since we have also the current cart ID here. Let's go ahead and create this parameter. So again, with the same syntax, we'll be getting this from the $this context, and we'll be getting the cart here, and let's get the ID, and don't forget the column here. There we go. Now if I do refresh my website, I will get the current ID is 9 with a message. So it's get a bit messy here, but you get the point. No, we are basically using the widget API in our favor, and we are passing parameter using it to our shop. Just in case you are wondering why we have this instruction, so again, it's related, it's cache related stuff. So if you'd like to use it, we simply need to wrap this here and add cross there, and just need to update this cache ID with we can do $this name here, and it will be basically pointing to the name of our module, which is in our case my basic module. In the next episode, we'll be creating the configuration page of our module. In this episode, we'll be creating a configuration page for our module. So for now, it basically do nothing other than displaying some random message all over the place, but we have no control on that if we put ourselves on the place of an admin of this website. So let's go ahead and add a page like, for example, this one, and we have the configuration page for our module. So how we can create a configuration page? So the answer is fairly simple, through the use of a certain method called getContent. We start with saying a public function, and it will be getContent. Now we will simply return this is the configuration page, and that's it. Now let's go ahead and test if this will take effect in our application. So back to the browser here, and let's simply refresh this page and search for our modules. There we go. This is my very first module, and do immediately see that we have a new option in our drop down called configure. Let's go ahead and click on that configure, and let's see what kind of content we will have. We have the message that we did define in that method. So this is the very first step on creating a configuration page for our module. Hello and welcome back to this new episode, in which we'll be adding more content and more dynamicity to our configuration page. So just to know that in this episode I'll be using the Prestashop Kit UI here to get some beautiful
element. And let me just move back to my IDE, and here the very first thing I would like to do here is create a template. So this is the very first approach, basically to dynamize your configuration page, and the second approach is using what we call the helpers, and this will be the topic for the next episode. And for now, I'll go ahead and create a template. So I'll just make this bigger that you could see what's going on. So I will go under my template directory here, and I'll create a new admin directory. And inside it, I'll create a new TPL file. For the name, it's up to you. You can call it whatever you want. In my case, I will call it configuration like this, .tpl. Okay. And inside it, I will throw some basic content like lorem 5 content or whatever. So it's just any text you would like to generate. And I'll move back to my controller here. And here, instead of this static text, I will return the fetch method. So this is the syntax if you forget. So you start with $this, and we do fetch here, and we basically pass a parameter with the path to the string here. So this will be the fetch. There you go, and that's the path here. Just need to update this to admin and this to be configuration. There we go. So let's go ahead and test this. There we go. So we have our text displayed correctly, but again, this is not satisfying. So we need to update it and to add some dynamic content. So the very first thing I would like to copy here is an input. So go to under forms here and normal, and let's pick, for example, this normal input. So click on show code and simply copy the very first form tag, and let's whip this and paste the thing there. Okay, so we need to have a form, right? So now if I do refresh, we do see that I have an input, but we can pretty much do nothing with it because we cannot submit it because it's not basically inside a form. So let's go ahead and add a form here to our file. So it will be form/form. There we go. And let's add the action here. So in order to get the action running properly, just leave it empty for the action. And for the method here, I will use the post. Well, we can use also the get. And I would like also to get a button here. So go to buttons block here and go to, for example, this little basic, and let's pick this primary button and simply copy this. Okay, moving back here, and let's duplicate this block and get rid of all the other ones and paste this button, changing the type to submit, and this should be good to go for now. So now if I do refresh, I have my input, the label, the input, and the primary thing. And what about making that input mandatory? So simply we need to add the required, and that's it. So now if I do submit without putting any content, we should be basically stopped. But here it seems like we had a little issue with our code. Sorry, I put required on the label. My apologies. So just place it right here. We don't need to define a value. So now if I do submit, we have that little tooltip saying that please fill on this field. Okay, good. Now let's make this more fun, and let's use the configuration object that we talked about it in the previous episodes. And if you forget, you can simply jump to, for example, the, let's say, reassurance module, for example, and let's search for configuration. And this is how we deal with this configuration object. So I will simply copy this little line here, and I will imagine that we will have a field called, let's say, course rating. Okay, so here I will do course rating will equals to configuration get, and here just we need to change this to course rating. And by the way, you can simply write it this way inside, but here just a convention to make things more easy for other developers to deal with your code. Just write everything in uppercase using these underscores, and here we'll be casting that to be an int. Okay, so now let's go ahead and pass this
course rating to our template. So just a reminder, we will be using the context, come on, and we'll be using the Smarty assign method, and we said that this method does accept an array. So here, this is the name of my variable, and this is the value, and there we go. So everything is ready now. Let me just copy this course rating and close this, moving back here, and I will define it to be the default value here. So if you forget, this is how we call in a variable in Smarty, curly braces, and for now we'll get a 0 because basically this instruction will return this instruction will return null, and since we are converting null to int, we get a 0. Let's go ahead and test this. So now if I do refresh, oops, sorry that, we have 0 here. Okay, now if I do submit, well, the submission went well, but nothing really happened, and this is what we are going to do in the next episode. Hi and welcome back to this new episode in which we will be adding a handler to our form submissions. So for now, as we did in the previous one, we simply have like this very basic input that do nothing for now, and we'll go ahead and implement the submission handler. So to do that, I will go ahead with some updates first on the module itself. So here I will define a variable called message, and by default will equal to null, and I'll explain why I will need this later. And I will start by calling the if and a specific helper called tools that will give me access to a certain method called get value. So if I hover it, look the description, get a value from the post or get, if unavailable, take the default value. So basically this is an interceptor that give me access to the post or the get object. Okay, so here I will be passing the name of the field that I need, that I'm watching, which is here the course rating. So I'll be passing that string as a param. So I'm saying if this is defined, then do the following execution. So our execution inside this will be basically the use of configuration object, and instead of get, I'll be calling the update value. And just a reminder about this update value, look at this description: update configuration key and value into the database, and automatically insert if the key does not exist. So basically this is insert and update at the same time. All right, don't forget the semicolon right there. And we need also to pass a second parameter, because here we are inserting something into this key and the value must be something with some value, right? So here I simply copy this here. There we go. And that will be our value, and this will be the key. Okay, the next thing is I would like to update this message variable with like success message. So let's suppose form saved correctly. All right, so like this I can display a message to the user to tell him that everything went well. All right, now the next step we need to do is to pass this message variable to our template that we can display it. All right, so at this point we can say that we are done with this basic module, the main class of the module. Now we could go back to our template, and here we'll be using the if statement. So this is how we write if statement in Smarty. So if else, it's very simple. Let me just get rid of these extra curly braces. So here we'll be writing our condition. Our condition will be basically that the dollar message will be different than zero, or null, sorry, different than null. So here we'll be defining our dollar message. There we go. So just a quick look back to the templates or storybooks about the Prestashop kit. I'd like to go to alert basics, and here I'll copy this block that is representing the success, which is this green block with these fancy colors, etc. So I'll go ahead and simply paste that thing there and get rid of this content, and I'll put my message
just inside these blocks. Okay, so here we can define whatever message we would like to define, like saying something went wrong, or just leave it empty for now. Okay, now let's go ahead and test if everything is working fine. So refreshing the page, now we have nothing here. So I'll write first or test, whatever, first update. Now if I hit there, I have my message. But just one thing here, I still have a 0 because we are basically converting explicitly all the returning result into an int here. So we are getting normally a string with this explicit conversation, then we'll get always 0. So now if I do refresh the page, I will have the first update. And as you may see here, we only have the message displayed only when we submit the form. So here, let me add the 7, for example, and there we go. So the message is here and the new value is here. So that was a quick and simple example on how to handle the form submission when your form is basically inside a TPL file. Hey everyone, welcome back to this new episode. So in the previous episode, we introduced the configuration page with a TPL file. In today's episode, we'll go a bit deeper with the Prestashop API and we'll be consuming the helper, the form helper, the more elegant way on dealing with forms on the admin side. All right, so let me just show you what I did comparing to the previous episode. So simply, this is the get content from the previous episode. I set it into a command and created a fresh one, get content, that for now simply return a call to an existing method display form. All right, so this display form, as the name match, will be responsible on generating the form. Okay, let's go ahead and create a public function here, and I'll call that a display form and without parameter. So in this display form, we'll be going through certain instructions that are needed that we can consume and benefit of the helper form, and I'll try to explain this slowly and line by line. So just to stick around, don't get lost. All right, so by the way, you can look at the documentation on the link that will show up now on the official Prestashop doc, that you get a better idea about the form helper, right? So let's get into our display form now. So the very first thing is I need the default language of the shop. So here I create a default link, and it will equal to the configuration object. So we use a lot of this configuration object. I'm using the get method, and here I will be using this key ps _lang _ default. All right. So for security reason, I would like also to cast this to an int, just to make sure that we always will get an integer right there. Okay, now we'll be creating the form inputs for our form. Is that correct to say? So here, let me add the small command here, form inputs. There we go, with a double P and an L. What a mess. So here I'll start by creating a fields variable that is basically an array. So the very first will be a 0, so we'll be having like one single form here, and let's define a form right there, and this will be basically a big array. So first of all, we need to define the legend of our form, and to keep it simple, let's simply assign the title of this legend, and there you go. So here I would like to say that this will be let me use the transfer story. This is trans. It will call rating setting, for example. You can call it wherever you want, really. You're not forced to use this kind of syntax or this kind of nomination. All right, so in addition to the legend, I can start now defining my input. So to do that, we need to create another entry in our table and call that input, and this input will basically contain an array of arrays. Okay, you get the point. So this will be my very first array, which basically means this my very first input. So here I'll go ahead and copy some instruction here from the documentation, and just to speed up the process and renaming things. So here I defined the type, that will be a text. The label here, it will be course rating, and there we go, course rating. The name, it must be the same name, just to avoid the trouble.
So here I'll call that module or course rating. The size required is true here, just to make it mandatory field. And also we need to add the form submission button. So here if I do submit, for example, well, sure, it must be inside double quote, and again it will be an array, and here I'll be define the title. So the title, again, I'll be using the translation method to make it translatable. Save the rating, for example, and we also can pass a class here, a bootstrap class, since we set it bootstrap to be true on the installation. So here, let me just remind you, we did this. There we go. So when we do this, we basically can benefit from the bootstrap classes. So here I will pass a list of basically classes. So btn, let's say primary, why not? And let's pull it to the right. So here, say pull right. Okay, so that's enough for my fields. So here, just a note, if you'd like to pass more than one field, you simply need to pass as much as you want. Just make sure to have a different name because that's unique for the submission later. Now we could start dealing with the helper form. After defining all these fields, I'll go ahead and create instance form helper. Okay, so create a helper variable here that will equal a new instance of the helper form. There we go. So it does not accept any params for now, but now we start defining some properties. And then here I will simply go ahead and copy some stuff because we have a lot of things to define, and I don't want that you waste your time watching this kind of things that you generally will copy paste. So let me just talk a bit about what's going in here. So we created the instance, as I said. Here we are defining the module that is basically it's simply an instance of the current module. Later we defined the name controller, which is also again the name of the module. This is why we are using this name attribute of our module. And here we're defining the token. So if you don't know what is a token, this is basically the token for security reason. So it be used later to verify that the form is submitted from the correct sources, etc., to validate the form. And the next attribute that we did define is the current index, so where we are right now. So it's simply the URL. Okay, after this we defined the default language. So pretty obvious what is the default language, and we defined also the allow employee form length that is required default language for the shop, again language stuff. And here we're defining some information about the box itself, the form. Okay, so the title requires the title for the form. The show toolbar requires a boolean value whether the toolbar is displayed or not. The submit or scroll, before that the toolbar scroll require a boolean. It must be whether false or true. So it's basically whether the toolbar is always visible when the page is scrollable and you have a lot of data. Also the submit action, so require the action attribute for the form submit tag, and it will show you this later on the form. And we have the toolbar btn that are basically the buttons that we need to be displayed on the toolbar. In example here we defined the save and the back. Okay, and that's it about defining the form stuff. Now we need to pass through a final action, let's say that, so which is the generate form. So here I'll do return $helper generate form. There we go, and this form will accept the fields we did define here. There we go. So let me just copy this, paste it, and let's test this work. Okay, so just refreshing the page again, just make sure that everything is set up and there is no issue. Okay, we have a little warning here saying that undefined index course rating, and we are getting this because we did not define a default value for our input, but we'll be doing that later. Now let me just focus on this form and I would like to inspect it. So first of all, we have the form with the configuration form ID, some classes injected, and we have my basic module. assign it right here, and we have the action that we did build during the initiation of the helper object. The method is post. We can define it wherever we want, if we get whatever. We have some ink type here, form data, in case we need to upload some images, etc. So now we have this hidden input called submit my basic module, and it has a value of 1. So this is basically defined right here inside this helper submit action, and let's go ahead and play around with it. So let's add, for example, a CCC here, and let's refresh the page and see what will happen to that little hidden input. So hidden input, there you go. Let me make this bigger. There we go. So now we have a submit CCCC my basic module, and this will be used later for validation, and we get back to that later. Let's carry on with our form. We have now the panel, which is this block here, this with the border and stuff. And inside it we have the panel heading, and this is the rating setting. And if you have a good memory, we defined that here. So rating settings, it's in the legend. There you go. And we have the form wrapper, which is the content of the form, and inside it we have a form group, and we have a label, and the label is exactly what we defined, course rating, and this is our label here. And also we have the call_lg9 that is containing the input itself, and we have an ID and the course rating as a name as we define it. And we have required set it to required as also we define on this size. Again, we did define that, and as you may see here, we can define the value, the classes, etc., and pretty lot of attribute. Now let's go ahead and fix this notice we do see here when we do land on the first time on this page. So let's go back to our IDE, and somewhere here before the generating the form, I will do the following. So I do helper, and I access the fields value, and this is an array, so I will need the key to point to that input, and here I will define the value. So the value will be basically configuration dot get. Like this, we will get current value from the configuration object, and we inserted that as a default value for our field. Now let's go ahead and test and see if this error will be removed. So refreshing. Now we don't have that warning, and we have the default value. Welcome back to this new episode. So now if I hit submit, let's see if this will update my form. Hitting the submit, do nothing for now, because we still did not implement the logic to deal with our form submission. All right, so to do that is again fairly simple with this API. So here I go back to my getContent method, this one, the newly created one, and I will use the same logic. So here I will add an if statement, tools, and instead of get value, I will use another method called isSubmit, and isSubmit will be used to basically intercept the hidden field that we talked about second ago, this little hidden field. So we need to test if this name has been submitted, and this name we cannot force it like this because it's auto-generated through a combination of string and name. So we simply need to copy that and pass this as a param. So when we submitted that element, that input, then we could do our logic, and our logic is fairly simple here. Will be basically updating the value inside the database, so we can copy this directly here, and let's go ahead and test if this is actually working. So now we have update value 7. I'd like to change it to 8, for example, and I hit save. Well, it seems like it's working, but we have two issues right here. First of all, the user have no idea about the state of the request. So we don't have whether a success message or an error message. And also another problem here, I could pass even an empty input here, and it will be accepted. And as you may see here, the empty value overrided the default value, which is a string here. So we need to add another layer of security into our system that it could really reliable. Okay, so the very first thing I would like to do here, I would like to create a new course rating variable that will host the submitted value of our field. So here I use the getValue method, and inside it, it will accept this value, this key, current course rating, sorry. All right, so here inside, I'll create this if statement and I will test the following. So first of all, we need to make sure that this is not empty. So I will start by this exclamation operator. Just make sure that it's available, right? And also we need to make sure that our value is not empty here. So use this operator and just make sure that it's not empty. So doing not empty, and we do course rating, and also make sure that it's valid as a generic name. So here I will add and is valid name, validate a generic name, and we pass our field again course rating. So if everything went well with this line here, then we can execute our configuration set. Okay, so we have a little error here. What's going on? Oh, the error is gone. Good. So if that went well, we'll be executing this. So sorry, here it must be this. It must be a set and not empty and valid as a generic name. So we'll be executing the query to the database, and we need to create here another variable, and let's call this output here. So let's call this output, or you can basically call it whatever you want. So here it will be by default an empty value, and in this output I will assign a success message. And this is one of the good features when you work with the form helper, that you can get benefit of the following class, which is display confirmation. And basically you can define whatever message you would like to define here. So in my case, let me call the trans method just to make sure all my strings on this form, on this module, sorry, are translatable. So here I will say form submitted successfully. Okay, don't forget a semicolon right there. Elsewhere, we do an else statement here. We can say that, come on, we simply could copy this, but it won't be a display confirmation, it will be display error. There you go. Form has not been submitted successfully. And there we go. And don't forget to concatenate our output here just to make sure that it will be displayed along our form. Now time for truth. So this is the case when we submitted the form without any data. So let's do that again and let's say what will happen. Okay, so we have form submitted successfully, which is stupid. I'm sorry for that. It must be an and. All these tests must pass that we could access this block. So now if I do refresh my page, normally I should get the error message. There we go, form has not been successfully submitted. Now if I update the value, the new value here, and I hit save, there we go. So we have form submitted successfully with a little beautiful message, and it's dismissible, and we have the value here. So that was the configuration page with... Hey everyone, and welcome back to this new episode. So today's episode will be talking about controllers. What are controllers in Prestashop? So the answer to this question is relatively simple. So it's as follows. Controllers are simply a PHP classes that do offer certain functionality, whether on the front side or the back side of our shop. This led us to the definition or to the conclusion that we have two different types of controllers in Prestashop. So the very first type is the front controllers, and in this front controllers we have also two types of them. So what we have the very first type, which is called the native controllers, that are basically classes that
get shipped with the default installation of Prestashop. And here I listed two of them, and I picked the cart controller here and the address controller. Also, we have what we call the module controller, and also they get native that a certain module are installed or pre-installed with Prestashop, and they come with their own controllers. Or our module that we'll be creating, we can also create controller for this module. So this is what we call the module controller, and here I listed a couple of them: the PayPal EC validation module front controller and the PS checkout payment module front controllers. And now let's move on to the second type of controllers in Prestashop, and they are simply the admin controller or the back controller. So here I'll be listing two of them, two types again. We have the native controller, those who come with the installation of Prestashop. For example, here we pick the admin access controller and the admin import controller, and also we can have admin controller through our module. And here the list take two of them: the admin block listing controller and the admin dashboard controller, or dashboard, sorry, controllers. So that was a really quick intro to what are controllers. And the next episode we take the very first type, which is the front controller, and we'll be dig a bit deep inside this type and try to see how to create one specifically for our module. Hi and welcome to this episode in which we will create our first front controller. So as we said previously, a front controller in Prestashop is mainly a class that adds a new feature to the front office of our shop. And in order to create a controller, a front one, there is some rules that we need to follow. So the rule number one is on the directory structure. So for example, here I pick my basic module, the one that we are working on, the module that we're creating during this course, and I'll go ahead and create a controller for it, a front one, okay? So the directory must be as follow. We start with a controller, sorry, I'm not typing here. Start with a controller directory with an S, and inside this directory create a new one called the front. So this is the right tree, let's say, of directories that we need to have, that our controller must be correctly place it, okay? So that was the rule number one, is directory structure. The rule number two is on the nomination of the class. So here I'll go ahead and create a new class, and I'll call this simply a test.php, and inside this file we have well, simply a PHP file that will contain a class. So the class name is a bit tricky here. The rule number one, or let's say the first part, the first string of the name of the class must be the module name. So here I'll move him back to my module main file and copy simply the class, okay? So my basic module. The next part of this string, it's the name of the file. So in here it's called test. I'll do the T in uppercase, and the third part, the last part, will be the module front controller, and this prefix is mandatory. We must have this attached to the class name in order to be considered as a front controller. Okay, and if you noticed here, I used the camel case in the nomination of all these parts. And the final rule here to have a front controller valid is to extend the module front controller. So at this point here we have a valid front controller, and in the next episode we will see how we can add real features to this controller, such as rendering templates and generating a link to this controller. Hi, in this episode we will render content using our freshly created front controller. So before creating any method and typing any code, there's two things that you need to know. That there is two kind of calls that our controller could handle. There is what we call the get requests, and there is also the post requests, okay? So the get I generally use it to retrieve data from the shop and display it to the end user, and the posters do some sort of the opposite. So it will get data from the user and persist it somewhere else on the shop or send it to a certain API or something like that. All right, so to handle these gets, and this will be the topic of this episode, there is a specific method that we need to implement, and this method is called the InitContent. So go ahead and here quickly create a public function and we'll call it InitContent. And if you look at here, IDE kind of pick up that this InitContent is being defined on the parent that we are extending here. I don't know what this Ghazal is doing here. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump to the module front controller core and search for InitContent. And there we go. So we have a method called InitContent defined right here. This means that what we are doing here is simply overriding that method from the parent, okay? So this method is doing pretty much the same thing as the ones that we used inside the module main class, like it will be rendering simply a template for us, okay? And optionally, we can pass for sure variables to this template and do some funny things. All right, so let's start with the basic things right here, which is the rendering of a template. So here I will start by calling this, and I will call this set template. And sure, here you can use the display or render or other method that allow us to return some templates. All right, so this set template, as you know, it accepts a path to a template, views / templates, and here it's the funny part that starts here. So instead of, let me just open this here. So we won't be pointing to a hook directory, but instead be pointing to this front directory and loading this test that I already created before start recording this episode. So templates, and from templates go to front, and from there let's go to test.tpl. Okay, so this is quite enough to have a valid method that is rendering some content to the end user. So in this test TPL, we have some no-sense text just for testing purpose. Also important to know, to manage that we can pass variables to this template, and this is done exactly the same as on the controllers. We'll be using the context API here. From Smarty, we call the assign method, and from there we will be passing an array. So here, let's suppose I'd like to pass something like data here, and this data will contain hello. Also good with our method, and one piece of code is still missing, which is calling the parent InitContent that should make our method well implemented. So here I will call parent InitContent, and we good. So now, I think you have a question in your mind. You may be wondering how we can access this my basic module controller from the browser. Well, this will be answered in the next episode. After that, we discuss the postProcess method that will be handling, as we said, the post requests. In this episode, we will introduce the post method that will be handling the post requests in our controller. So to do that, we said that we need to implement a certain method called postProcess. So let's go ahead and just type public function here, and this function will be called postProcess. Okay, so for now, the method does not accept any parameters, so we can take off all these codes, and inside this block of code in between these brackets, what kind of content we'll be putting? Well, basically the logic will be that we have some sort of module at the front page of our controller, for example, generated by this InitContent, and the user will be submitting some data and it will be intercepted at this function. So at the end of this function execution will be end up with some sort of redirection. So basically we'll be using the tools class, so doing something like this to be tools redirect, and here we'll be passing the URL where we want to redirect our browser or our user to. So here there is a point that you need to pay attention to, which is the execution order of functions inside this front controller. So let me just show you this little image that will illustrate a lot of things for you. So this is how the methods inside our controller are being executed. First of all, we have the constructor that is basically setting up the members stuff of our controller, etc. Then we have the init. After that, we have the set media and set media mobile. So they're basically for all the assets, JavaScript and CSS. Then we have the post-process. And if you look carefully here, we have post-process being executed just before the init header and init content. Meaning any code we'll be putting inside this method will be executed before doing the init content. So here we must pay attention. So this is why inside our post-process we need to do the following. So here normally we'll be expecting some kind of input to be submitted. So we'll be using the if tools, for example, is submit, and here will be some kind of form ID, something like this, and it will be wrapping all the execution inside this if statement. So by this implementation, we make sure that our post-process, well, it will be actually executed before the init content bit. We will make sure that nothing will happen unless we have a form submitted. So let me just continue with this image. So we have the init header. After that, we have the init content, then init footer, and finally we end up with a display that will be displaying content. So that was a quick intro about the post-process. For sure, we'll be coming back to this later when we start creating the payment module, especially when we have like payment validated or payment rejected, and we do redirect our user to certain URLs. And the next episode, we'll see how to generate a link to our front controller. Hey, and welcome back to this new episode in which we will finally generate a link to our front controller. So there is a way actually to generate a link to a front controller. The way number one is the classic way, using the link class and the method getModuleLink. And there is another way that we'll be seeing in the next episode that is not well known. It's using a certain hook called moduleRoute. Okay, so let's go ahead so quick here and introduce the very first way. So here I'm under the render widget of my module class, and here I will use this for only debugging. So I will be calling the method that we talked about, link from the getModuleLink from the link class. So here I'll get the context, and just to get the context. So basically the context in Prestashop is kind of big array containing a pool of classes and method available for us to use all over the place where we want. So here this link is available for us here. So I will call getModuleLink right here, and here it's context, not content. There you go. So this does make sense now. And this method basically accepts the very first parameter, which is the module. And here I'll be using our current module. Then we pass the controller that we need to render, that we want to render. And finally, we end up with an array that will be containing basically the parameter that we need to pass. Okay, so there is also some SSL stuff and a language and ID shop that is not interesting for us at this stage. So here I said this will be the current module. And the next parameter here will be our control that we created in the previous couple of episodes. So here, instead of passing this long name, we are going simply, to pass the name of the file. So here, the second parameter will be simply a string called test, and that should be enough. So let's go ahead and test if this is basically working. So now I'm on the front page and I could see that I have a link here. So let me just refresh the page just to make sure that everything is fine and working as expected, except I'm on the wrong page here. So go back to the demo, and this is the link. So control click, go to this, and there we go. So we have a text, kind of lorem text that is coming basically from this little page called test.tpl that we created previously. So let's go ahead and make this more pleasant to the eye, and let's extend the page.tpl, and inside this will be going to override a block called page content. After this, we could place wherever we want. So let's go ahead and type in each one tag here, hello Mr. Prestashop, for example. Yeah, there we go. So now if I do refresh this page, I should say a beautiful page with all the content, the menu, etc., and my little content being displayed right there, and all is okay. So let me just explain a bit why I did extend. So we have the notion of hierarchy templating on SmartTTPL. So we have this page.tpl as a parent, and it allows other templates to override the blocks defined inside, and the block that we did override is simply this layer 1 page content, and by extending and defining a block we are able to inject whatever content at this little location of the page.tpl. So that's it for the getModuleLink. In the next episode we'll discover the hook that I told you about. Hey, and welcome back to this new episode. So today's, as I promised, I will show you the hook to create your own custom links to your front controller. So we need first of all to go to our module here, and we need to update the install method. So here I'm going to register a new hook, and this hook is called ModuleRoutes. And we need also to add a new method that will be hookModuleRoutes. You guess it. Okay, hook routes, and here it's a public function again. So again, it will accept the $params, the famous variable here. And what it does do, it simply will return an array of some parameters. So let's go ahead and define this little array. So by the way, we can return a multi-dimensional array here. So we can return basically multiple links to multiple controllers here. And here I will start with test. So here I'll call it test. And by the way, you can call it whatever you want here, but here simply to get reference that we are talking about the test controller. Okay. So this test will basically contain another array here. So the attribute number 1, if you can say that, it will be the controller, the entry number 1. So this controller will be containing what kind of controller we would like to render. So in my case, it will be test again. The next attribute or next entry will be the rules. And this is quite important because this will be the URL that will be typing on the browser to access this page. Okay. So here, what about doing a front controller test, something like this? You can, by the way, type whatever you want here. So here you can also define a keywords array for your keywords for SEO stuff. So here again, it will be an array. In my case, I will leave it simply empty. Okay. And the next entry here, I can pass the params, and here this is also quite important because it will be containing some vital entries for our link. So FC front controller, here I'll be defining the $this, and it will be the name. The next thing will be the module. Oh, sorry, here FC mean a front controller or not, so I'll go ahead and switch this to module. So this will be the current module, and FC will be a front controller module, so it will be containing module. And finally, again, I will type the controller, and our controller will be called, as we said, test. All right, so one more thing to do is through the admin panel of our shop is to reset the modules. And here I will search for my module, so it's named after my name. Let's do reset, click there. Okay, all is green here. Now, if I go back and do refresh, well, we should not see anything different, except when we type that URL that we typed here, that we defined basically here, FC test, we should see our content. I will type /FC, and there we go. So this is our text. Hello, Mr. Prestashop, being rendered using a custom URL. Hi, in this chapter we will talk about the admin controllers in Prestashop. So the first question you may be asking is, what is actually an admin controller? Well, it's mainly a PHP class that adds some features to the admin side of Prestashop, and with the latest 1.7 version, the admin controllers can be classified into two different types of controllers. We have what we call the legacy controllers that are basically based on a Prestashop custom framework and go a long way back. it's important to mention that all front controllers and admin controllers that haven't been yet migrated to Symfony yet are based on this custom framework, the legacy framework. And basically a legacy controller is what we saw previously in 1.6 and what we have also in 1.7. And the second type here is the modern controllers. So as we know, the big changes that came with Prestashop 1.7 is the implementation of the Symfony Framework, while the switch is being done in a steady pace. Starting on the 1.75 exactly, we can rely on the modern controllers and add a new entry to our application. So using modern controller, we will have access to debug toolbars, the Symfony service container, the twig templating engine, the doctrine for the database management, etc. So for the views also we can rely on the Symfony default templating engine, as we said, twig, and also we have the Prestashop UI kit that is available for us, and it's built on top of Bootstrap 4, and it does guarantee the consistency with other back office pages. So alright, after this quick intro, it's time to tackle the subject with more details. So in the coming episode, we will learn how to create a legacy controller and a modern controller. Hi, in this episode, we will focus on the admin legacy controller. So to create a legacy controller, the first step to do is to set up the correct directory structure. Legacy controllers must be under the following path: your module name or your module directory /controllers/admin. So let's go back and apply this to our module. So here my basic module is the root of my module, and I go to the controls that is already created previously, and I go ahead and create a new directory here, and I call this admin, all in lowercase. Now it's time for the main controller file. It can be created under the admin directory with no specification for the name, and just a good practice is to concatenate the admin keyword to distinguish it from other controllers. So here I'll go ahead and click new file, and I will call it admin. I will concatenate the test and .php. So here I go ahead and copy this, and let's open this file. So inside the file, the class name must be the file name followed by the keyword controller, and it must extend the module admin controller. So here I'll start with a simple PHP tag defining the class keyword, and as we said, this is the file name admin test, and we need to concatenate the controller. And third rule is to extend the module admin controllers. Now we can say that we have a valid admin legacy controller, but it still doesn't do any duty. In the previous video, we created this legacy controller, but it's useless and it do nothing for now, and we need to do some tweaking. So it's important to know that these admin controllers are special, and Prestashop provide an API built upon what we call the active record pattern in order to make these controls featureful. So here you may be wondering, what is the active record pattern and how it is implemented with the Prestashop. So the main idea behind the active record pattern is to create an object that will illustrate the structure of the database table. Okay, so this will allow us to access certain, let's say, classes and feature and methods, etc., that will allow us to deal with the database directly without typing any SQL queries. All right, so I'll explain this in the next episode, so don't worry if you don't understand anything. And the next question is how Prestashop does implement this. This is being done through a class called ObjectModel here, and I do invite you to check it. It does live under the classes directory, and it does contain methods and properties and stuff that allow us to deal with our database. So here in the following illustration, I try to draw global system to explain to you what is going on behind the curtain. So the idea here is that we'll be having a certain module that will allow the admin, that will allow the users of the shop to leave comments and feedback on the products, and we'll be hiring someone that will be dealing with commands like approve them, delete them, etc. So we have our guy here at the top of the tree, and he's dealing through some CRUD operation with our admin controller. So the question here, how this admin controller will be able to deal with stuff with commands stored inside the database somewhere here on this layer at the bottom. So once the user sent let's say a delete request, the admin will intercept that call and he will communicate with this layer, Prestashop active record implementation, that is basically, as we said, the object model class. Alright, so here we have another player called the comment.class.php, and this is basically the illustration of this database table. So we'll be having here public ID, public user, and public command that are basically entries on the table. Okay, so the special thing about this command class that it will be extending this object model, and by extending that it become active record pattern compatible, if you can say that, and the core of Prestashop allow our admin controller to deal with the database through this class. Alright, so this may be a bit confusing. I will explain this in the next episode with a real example, but I really do invite you to rewatch this episode that you could understand what's going on with the system. So in the next episode, we'll put this in action. Hi and welcome to this new episode in which we will set up the admin controller to deal with the database table through what we call the active record pattern through basically the object model class. So we need first to create the database table, and this will be happening through the install method of our module. So this is what I've done just to speed up things. I created some script, and let me just explain what's going on here. So firstly, I created this SQL install method that basically contain an SQL script that will be creating a database table when we do install the module. And here we are returning the db_get_instance execute, and by the way, this execute does return a boolean, as you may see here. So also I add the call to this method in the install method. So here this will return true. If it's true, then the execution will continue correctly, elsewhere something will be broken and the module won't be installed. And also I created another method here. I call it SQL uninstall. So it simply do the opposite of the install. It will be dropping the table that we did create, and again it does return a boolean from the execute method, and also I did call it inside the uninstall method. Like so, I guarantee that once I uninstall the module, then all the data related to it will be simply gone. So here another important method that we need to create is the install tab. We need to create basically a new entry in the menu, in the admin menu for our controller page. So to do that, I'll go ahead and create a public function here, and our function will be called, let's say, install tab. Okay, and it will contain a very simple script. And let me just explain to you what will happen here. So first of all, I'll go ahead and create a new variable. I'll call it tab here, and it will contain a new instance of the tab class. Okay, so this tab class, or tab, sorry, is responsible of creating admin menu. So this is our target. We need to add a new entry to this menu here. So after creating the instance, I will need to define some properties. So the very first thing I would like to define here is the class name. So what is the class that will be displaying right here? Will be simply the admin task, that is our admin legacy controller. Next attribute I'm going to define here will be the module. It will be simply our current module. So here I will simply do $this and name. And we need also to define the parent where we need to display this menu. So here in my case, I'll be using the default, so it will be on the root of the menu somewhere here. And the next attribute that we need to define is the icons. What kind of icon you would like to have for your menu. For example, the stat, this is the icon, the customer service, this is icon, etc. The next one, we need to do some language stuff. So in case we need to have our module to be available for multi-languages. So I will go ahead and simply copy this code really quick here. So here, simply we are getting all the languages available on the shop, and we are doing a for each. And for each language, we are simply defining what kind of label that will be displaying, right? So it's fairly simple. And finally, we end up with a simple try and catch that will verify that everything went well. So we'll be executing the tab save method that will be resist the new tab into the database and create a new entry in the menu. And final thing to do with this method is again to call it inside the install method, this install tab, and there we go. Okay, so again, as we did with the install method, we need to create the uninstall method. So we need to go somewhere down here, and I'll simply go ahead and copy this just to speed up a bit things. Public function here, instead of install, it will be uninstall. There we go. And it will simply reverse what's happened through this method. And here I will go ahead and real quick copy some code just to speed up things. It's fairly simple, nothing really fancy here. So here we are creating an ID tab that will be simply calling a method called getID from the class name, and the class name is simply test. So by executing this method, we'll be getting the ID to that menu, that we created during the execution of the install tab. And once that's true, we will be simply executing the following script. So the following script is fairly simple. It's an if statement here. We're testing that if this is true, is correct, it's not null, then here we're creating a new tab using that found ID, and we will try to delete it. If that went well, here we'll be returning a true, elsewhere it will be echoing the message and returning a false. And again, we need to call this method on the uninstall method of our module. So here I'll go ahead and add these statements. For now, don't forget the dollar right there. All right, now time to test. We need to reset our module. That change could get persisted to the system. So go to the module manager, and here I will search for my module. There we go, my very first module. Click reset, yes, and we ran into a little trouble, an exception. So if you ever face this kind of problem, what you need to do is to change the order of these calls here. So it's always good to call all the SQL things, all the SQL queries at the beginning of the statement. So here I will place SQL install, the install tab at the beginning of the method, keep the parent install call here, and at the end we have the calls to register all the hooks. So let's go ahead and retest and see if this will basically solve the problem for us. So my first module, hit reset, yes, and there we go. So now we have green message, meaning that everything went well. Also, if we look here to the bottom, we see that we have the test admin controller being available for us. Well, if we click on the link, we see nothing for now because we simply didn't define anything to be displayed. Yeah, so when you see this, mean that everything is fine. So let's go ahead and click on this. There we go. So this is test admin controller. The page is empty. So now I just want to show you that everything is fine also on the database. This is our database explorer, and there we go. This is the table available for us here with the right structure ID, user ID, and command. So that's good for this setting. In the next episode, we will see how we can display a real content on this page. So in today's episode, we'll be creating the comment.class.php that we said that will be extending the object model, and it will be describing the database table. Previously, we reconfigured our module to create a new entry for our legacy controller, for our admin legacy controller, and we configured a script to create a database table. So let's go ahead and real quick create a new directory here. So under the root of my module, I'll create new classes directory, and inside it I'll go ahead and create a new file, and I call it comment.class.php, and this is what we said previously. So before that we carry on, I just want to say a quick word about why I created classes and a file inside it. Well, it's simply a good practice, and if you would like, you can create your file directory under the root, and there is no problem on that actually. But to keep things organized and easy accessible, I prefer always to group files with topics at the same directory. So it's up to you whether to adopt this technique, or you go flat and all the file on the root. So let's go back to the file here, and here start with a simple PHP class here, and our class, it's up to you. You can call it wherever you want. It does not have any rule on the class, just to avoid any existing class. You cannot, for example, call it cart like this, because this will cause problem for the core of Prestashop. And in my case, go ahead and call it comment test, and it will extend the important object model that we said previously, and that's okay. Okay, so this class, as we said, it will be a representation of the database table we created during this SQL install. So it must contain three attributes: the ID, the user ID, and the comment. So here I will copy paste this real quick here. And next we need to create a very important public static attribute called definition. So what is this definition? It is defined inside the object model core here. So if you do search for it here, you will find that is defined as a public static. So what we are doing here is simply overriding again. There we go. So this is a public static definition, and we are overriding it right here since we are extending this object model. Okay, so what is this definition table? Let's answer this question. Well, it's simply an array that is describing our database table, and it does contain entries like the table, like the primary, the fields. That is simply a PHP illustration of the database table. So go ahead and create it that you could understand this better. So we have some entries. The very first entry that is very important for us is the table. So here the table will be telling the object model what is the table in the database that we need to deal with through this comment test class. So here I go back to my basic module, and I would like to copy this instruction, and like so, we guarantee that we have everything on dynamic. All right, the next attribute that we need to define is primary here, and primary simply is the primary key of our table. And let's check it back, and here we set it to be the ID, so paste the ID. And also we have a couple of other attributes that we need to define, and basically they are optional here, but I'll go ahead and add them anyway. So we have the multilang here, and we have multilang shop, and I'll define them to be true. All right, now let's move on to another very important attribute in our array, a very important entry, which is the fields. So as the name describes here, it is the description of the fields of our table. So the very first column that I'll be describing here is the user ID. So your question here, why we did not describe the ID? Well, because simply it is defined as a primary key, and if we do define a value or a column as a primary key, there is no need really to redefine its rules inside the fields. Okay, so here the fields will be simply an array again, and this array will be containing the type of this field. So the type here, it will be self, and it will be an int type here. Okay, and also we can define what is the size of this. Okay, And we need also to define the validate. So when we do accept the submitted value for this user ID, and we could also define whether it's required or not. And there we go. So we have a valid data for our user ID. Now I'll go ahead and duplicate this real quick and define the rules for the comments. So here, change this to comments. The self type, it must be of type string here. And the size, it must be 255, for example. The inner it must be is clean HTML. And is it required? Yes, it's true. So after this, we can say that our class is ready and has all the needed information to deal with the database. Just keep in mind that you can define more methods here in case you'd like to create some custom queries, for example, selecting by date or something like that, something really customized. You can create extra method here, but for now we will stick with this because it's enough for our API to work. And in the next episode we will discover how we can put this in action and to display data on this page of our legacy admin controller. In today's episode, we will be consuming this class inside legacy controller. So previously we did define the command class, we defined some database information, etc, etc. So the very first thing that we need to do here is to import this class inside our controller using the required ones here, and simply use this constant that is pointing to the modules directory, and I typed the path to that file. What we need to do next is we need to define an override for the constructor, and I will for now do the parent underscore construct. There we go. Oh, sorry, not that one. Construct. Very good. All right. So now if I do refresh the page, I see nothing is changed because we need to define and override some attributes from the module admin controller. So we need to tell our controller what kind of table you need to display and fetch data from. So here, this will be the very first attribute, and it will be simply table. And if you remember, the name of the table is being defined right here. The only thing that we need to type the name of the table without the prefix, okay? Because here, when we do PS, for example, command table, then we'll be having a trouble. So let me just show you what I mean. So here, I will copy the same syntax here, and I will set it as a value. Now, if I do refresh, well, for now, we don't have any error, but later we'll be getting back to this because I'll explain the error in more details. So the next attribute that we need to override here is the class name. And here it's fairly simple because it does mean what is the class that I need to follow that I can understand the table structure, and the class is simply our comment test. So here I will set the value to comment test, and the next attribute will be the identifier. Okay, so what is the identifier? It is simply the primary key of our definition attribute. So here I will access it directly since the identifier, or since the definition is static, so we can do something like comment. There we go. Okay, now let me check again. So everything's still okay, no changes, no errors. All right, so what is happening behind the scene is that Prestashop core is using this class but does not know what kind of data to display, okay? Because he's fetching the table, okay, but he does not output anything because we need to define our next attribute, which is fields list. Okay, so fields list will be a table simply similar to this one we defined it right here. So it will be containing user ID, command, and ID. So here let's start with the ID, and it accepts an array. So the array here be containing some very basic entries like the title here, and it will be the ID. And let's define also, for example, in a line property, and let's set it to center. All right, now if I move back and now refresh the page, I run into a problem because I forget a semicolon first of all, that it must not be there, but instead here. And if I do refresh, there we go. So this is the problem that I was going to talk to you about, the double table prefix being injected right here. So normally our table is called ps test command, and here we have ps test command. This is why we need to keep it simple and remove this prefix. Now if I do refresh the page, I will have this. So this is the test admin. It's showing me 0, meaning there is no record for this table, and we have a little message, no records found, and some ugly buttons that look seriously ugly. All right, so to fix this displaying issue, we need to use the bootstrap here, and to enable bootstrap, we need to override this property called bootstrap. So you simply set it to true, and now if I do refresh, I will have the bootstrap UI displayed, and everything looks fine and beautiful. All right, so one more thing I would like to do here, I would like to add the definition to the other entries of my table. So here we'll be having user underscore ID, and here we'll be having the comment, and I would like to change these labels to comment user ID, for example, and let's change this to the left. Okay, so here let's become left. Now if I do refresh, it will become more better. It's kind of yes, and just more information about this class, that we can add what we call the active add row action. So basically what are row action? They are some sort of drop down actions that you could see on the list. Let me just show you. For example, let's go to catalog and product list, and I'll show you what I mean by actions. So these are the row action: preview, delete, and duplicate. So here our row action here, I'll define edit, and I'll define delete, and define also view. So unfortunately now we cannot experience these buttons because we do not have any data, as you may see here, no records found. And in the next episode I will show you these buttons, because now if I click on add a new, yeah, we don't see anything, but the page is working fine, and this will be the topic of the next episode. Hi and welcome back to this new episode, in which we'll be creating a form for the add a new page. Alright, so to create a form, we need first to override the render method from the admin module controller, and here we need to define some properties inside of that in order to get our form. So what we need to define first is the fields form. There we go, and this fields form does accept an array as a value. That will be a definition of some entries on the table. So the very first thing that we need to define here is the legend, and if you don't know what is the legend, you will discover this in a second. So again, we'll be defining an array here, and I will set the title. So the title will be new, for example, command. All right, now if I move back here, I do refresh, I see nothing, meaning that I did not break my code, but I'd like to test that this fields form is working correctly. So here I will call the parent render form right there. Okay, now if I do refresh, I should see something different. Well, it seems like I went quicker than the compiler. Let me refresh again, and there we go. So this is the legend, and this is the title we did defined. And by the way, we can define also an icon here. So if I do icon, and let's go with icon cog, for example, let's say if this will change things. There we go. So we have a little cog displayed right there. Okay, so let's carry on with our fields form, and in addition to the legend, we need to define the fields that we need to display. So here, it's time for the input that is simply the fields, okay? So again, it's an array here and an array of arrays. So the very first array will be for the ID. So it will be the type here as the first parameter, and it'll be saying that this is a text, for example. the next will be the label. So the label that will be displaying the ID. Yes, maybe it's a stupid idea to display the ID, but we are testing while learning, so no worries. And we can also define the name, which is really important here because this will be the mapping between the database and the form. So here it will be the ID, and we can define also some classes here for Bootstrap things. Yes, and what about defining the required? Also, we can define a message. Let's say here a message or empty message, sorry. So kind of things like this, you can define many properties. So we have a little problem with the required. Expression is not writable because simply it's an assignment, not an equal. And there you go. So we have the ID here, and we have the ability to basically type what is the ID of our form, which is a stupid idea, but anyway, we are testing as I said. So here I will change the name to user underscore ID, and I will quickly duplicate this. So okay, so what is missing in our form is the submission button. So here I'll go ahead and add a new attribute to our array. So here I will do submit, and I will again inject a table. So here the submit will be containing the title. So here let's say, okay, again I forget the row. Submit the comment. Okay, refreshing, and there we go. So we have submit the command and we have the cancel button. Now let's go ahead and test with some dummy data. So the user will be ID. So submit the command, and we have a little issue because he's saying here that ps_ps test command is not defined or does not exist. So the problem here is on the level of our command class, and this is where it's happening exactly. This is why we need to take off this prefix and let Prestashop deal with the table prefixes. So now if I do refresh the page, I should see my message correctly displayed, except not is not working. And here we have the length does not exist because we set length to true. So here we need to switch this to false in order to allow our data to be saved without multi-language stuff. So now if I do refresh, I should see green message successful stuff has been saved, and we have 2 entries, and we have the chance to discover what I told you about the row action. So we have delete, we have the views. Let's see the views. How does it look like? It's an empty page because we still did not define the method that handle this view, and we have the delete that is native. So if I click delete, we have this delete prompt, and if I do validate, then the element is deleted from the database. And even if I do refresh here, we don't see that deleted entry. So that was how to added the view to create a new entry in the database. And the next episode, we will see how we can add the view to view actually the selected database entry. Hey, and welcome back to this new episode. So previously we created this beautiful UI with all the clicks and all the things, and also we added this action rows, the edit, delete, and the views. And if you still remember from the previous episode, when we click on the views, we get basically nothing. It's an empty page with a weirdo URL, and this will be the topic of this episode and the next one too. So how we can display something on this page. All right, so before that we dive into this, I wanna tell you that I did some updates for our code here, specifically the comment class. So the user ID here is not really user ID, it's kind of name or something like this. And we already defined a primary key to be the ID here. And even if we look to the database, we have the ID here set as an assigned, well, what's wrong with me? And it's on auto increment, it's the primary key, and the user ID and the command are just simply simple inputs, let's say. And you can really type whatever we want there. So this is why I changed the type to self string, and also the validation to accept any valid clean HTML content. All right, so let's close this one and get into our subject. So how we can display data on this page, on this view URL? The answer is fairly simple. So I start by creating a public function here, and my function will be called render view. So it is fairly simple because we are overriding a method again from the admin, not from the admin task, but from the parent controller that we are extending here. And let me just remind you, we are extending the admin module admin controller actually. All right. So now here, this method basically needs to return some sort of TPL, but for now, let's go ahead and type hello. And let's see if we're gonna have any rendered data. There we go. So we have a little message saying hello right there, but this is not fairly enough. It's not the best practice to return content from the methods, but instead the best practice is to render content from the TPL files. And this is why I'm going to create the following files. So here under the views templates, I go ahead and create a new file that will be created under a new directory called admin. And here I'm going to call it view.tpl. So by the way, the view, the name of the file, it's up to you. You can really call it wherever you want. And I start by displaying some 20 character, some lorem 10 characters for now. Okay, so let's go back here and see how we can render this view TPL. This syntax is a bit new comparing to what we used to do. So here I'm going to use the context as always, and here I will use Smarty, and from Smarty I will access a method called create template. So what does this method do? If you click on it, on this little description they said create a template object. So it will take a file and compile it in some source, and it will return a template object for us. Okay, so this create template, the very first and the important parameter for us is the template itself. So here I go ahead and create TPL file variable here just to keep things more organized, and I'm going to pass it here as a parameter. So for now I'm going to leave it as empty, and here it will be our variable. Just forget the $sign right there. Okay, so here we need to load our file that we created, the view.tpl. The next line that we need to execute here, and since this TPL is an object, we need to render this template, and it will be through the execution of fetch. Okay, so fetch will do this. So let's go ahead and open this fetch. It will fetch and render a Smarty template. Okay, there we go. So fetch is okay. We can get rid of this dumpy hello. And one more thing to do, we need to return this instruction. Okay, now if I do refresh, well, it's broken because I failed to load the correct file. So let me just check my codes here. There we go. This is an extra views. Now if I do refresh, well, we could say that we have the text that we did type inside the template. Now let's go ahead and see how we can assign variables to this TPL. So to do that is fairly simple. Again, we'll be using the classic assign method. And here this assign, as always, it does accept an array of variables. Just need to move it down after the initiation of the variable here, and I'm going to create a small array here. And you know the syntax to display variables, I hope. So here I go ahead and create a quick each one here, and curly brackets and the curly braces, each one, deck, refresh, and we have 1, 2, 3. So our template is working fine, but it's still displaying some dummy data. This will be the topic of the next episode, how to display the real data on this TPL. All right, folks, let's go ahead and make this page display some real data. Okay, so we could leave this for now, and let me move back to this admin task controller. So here I go ahead and add quickly a small command before here. So assign vars, and here also fetch data. Okay, so in Prestashop, to fetch data from the database, we don't need really to write SQL stuff like the ugly SQL queries and hustle with the joining and all that kind of stuff. So we have an amazing class called DBQuery. It's a helper that allows us to write SQL query and directory directly. So here, go ahead and create an SQL variables here, and it will contain an instance of a DBQuery. All right, and from now on, we'll be using this SQL to write our SQL queries. All right, so go ahead and SQL here, the very first instruction, it will be simply select. So what are the fields that I will be selecting? And in my case, I will select all the fields, and the next method, let's say, or the next things that I would like to get is the from. So from where I'm going to select. So I'm going to select data from our table, and in our table is called test command. So here, go ahead and use this dynamic access to the table. So instead of writing a string, let's use this fancy way to access data. Okay, so after selecting all from this, what is the condition to select? So I'm not going to select all the inputs, but instead I'm going to select the specific line that I have its ID. So here I will say the where, and where basically the ID. So if you forget what kind of data, you can go to the command class, not this one, command class, and here you could say that we have the ID as the primary key. So we could do ID, and you could compare it to whatever input you need to compare it. And in our case here, we'll need to compare it to this. So if you look to the URL here, we have ID equal to 2. So I'll go ahead and copy that ID. And here I'll use another helper, the tools helper we used before. The next thing is to execute this SQL query. So if we do display this SQL in the let's say in the browser, let's see what we'll have. So we have select all from blah 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 where ID equal. So here it seems like we have a little problem. It must be equal to dot here. Now, if I do refresh my page, I have the valid can I select all from PS command where ID equal to 2. And if you look carefully here, we have the prefix being added automatically, which is really good. Okay, now we are going to execute. So we need to use a DB class. So DB get instance. And from this get instance, I'm going to execute another method called execute as, and I'm going to pass the SQL as a param, and let's store this here as a variable. Let's go ahead and print this data, and let's see what this data looks like. So we have okay, let's go ahead and hide this for now. So we have 0, 1, I mean like we have one index, one element, it's an array, ID equals 2, user equal to Tommy, and command equals to Wahoo. If I go to the previous page and click on another one, let's pick this John for example, click view, and we have user ID is John and command is great, which is basically it does mean that everything is working fine and our data is being fetched from the database. So here I'm going to change my assign method. I'm going to assign the $data. So here you can add more testing. You're checking if the data is there or not, but since this is for explanation purpose, I won't get deep into that, sorry. So here in the views, instead of data here, going to do data.name, or not name, basically it will be user ID, as we said, it will be like the name here. So that will be the first section of the first info to be displayed, p tag here. There we go. Now if I do refresh, something get broken. Well, okay, here if we look at this array, we do see that we have an index. So the index number 0, we need to access it in order to get access to all the data. So here we need to tweak things like this. So here data 0 here, and the rest should be good. Now if I refresh again, there we go, we have a John and we have the message saying great. And if you click on Tommy, we should see Tommy and Wahoo. So one more thing before that we do finish this episode, I would like to show you how you can use the global layout, the Prestashop UI kit, in order to get these beautiful page styling, etc. So inside our TPL here, I'm go ahead to and create a panel class. You could paste the rest of the code inside, and immediately things start to get better. We have this white box with borders, etc. And if you'd like to get more deep with this, you could search Prestashop UI kit panel, and this is the official website from the dev docs, and I do explain all what you need to do with this, and the repository does explain things far much better. And I'll leave you the link to this build Prestashop UI kit. So that was how to create a view page for an admin module controller. Hey, before that we move on to another topic, I just want to show you something that you can deal with this page, with the data of your controller through your own TPL file without the use of this API of the helpers and all that kind of stuff. So to do that, it's fairly simple. Just keep in mind that you need to deal with all the things, with all the buttons, all the actions, etc. if you decided to use a specific template instead of the API. Just keep in mind. But let me just show you how you can do this. So to do that, we need to start by implementing a public function, and our function will be called InitContent. So InitContent is again coming from the parent controller. So inside this content, I'll go ahead and initiate the parent call. So here parent InitContent. And after the InitContent, go ahead and create a content variable. For now, it will contain some no sense HTML content. We need to pass this content to the main template of the admin controller. So it's a bit complicated to say, but the following syntax will explain things better. So here I'm going to call the classic context smarty assign, yeah, you know that, assign. I'm going to pass an array, and in this array I will say this is the content, and for this content I'm going to pass $this content, and I will concatenate my $content. Okay, now if I do refresh the page, look what will happen. I have hello from planet Earth with the default data being rendered through the helpers API. Okay, so from this we can conclude that in our parent controller we have this content that is being injected into a certain TPL in the backend. So if I do take this away and I keep simply this content, look what will happen. So immediately we get rid of the data being rendered by the API, and we have our data. Okay, hello from planet Earth. So here I just want to show you something, which is the ordered execution in the execution of controller functions. It's from the official documentation. So first we have the construct that set all the controllers member variables, and from one of these variables is basically this content. So the content is being initiated somewhere here. And what we are doing here, we are simply overriding that content that has been passed to the template with a new variable, with a new data. After that, we have the init, which is not implemented in our case, and we have the set media mobile. We have postProcess, init header, init content, and look where it comes, the init content. It's basically after 3 or 4 method, and this is why when we override the content, we did override the content that being initiated by the constructor. Finally, we end up with init footer and display Ajax. So now let me show you how we can load or use a TPL instead of no sense text. So to do that, again, we'll be using the context smarty. So the fetch will be pointing to a certain TPL that I'm going to copy the code to it real quick here. So here I'm going to be pointing to a configuration TPL that I already created. It's right here containing some no sense text. So let's go ahead and test this, what will give me. There we go. So we have the big content lorem. Let's go ahead and wrap it inside the panel real quick. There we go. And refreshing, and there we go. So now your controller is using your own template. Now it's up to you to deal with all the buttons, as I said.